Jay Orban was born in 1959 in Las Vegas, Nevada, into a middle-class family. His father worked as a slot machine technician, and his mother was a nurse at a private clinic. Jay was the youngest of 3 children as a child. He had a calm disposition, loved technology, and was interested in business. He attended a regular public school where he did not excel academically, but already as a teenager he showed an entrepreneurial streak, helping his father repair old slot machines and earning extra money by reselling small handmade items at flea markets. After graduating from high school, he enrolled in a business college at the University of Nevada, but did not finish his studies, dropping out in his second year to focus on private trade. His first successes came in the 1980s. He started selling jewelry, buying it wholesale from small craftsmen in the South and reselling it in the Western states. Gradually, he built up a client base, established connections, and over the next decade became a respected independent distributor. In the 1990s, he moved to Phoenix, Arizona, where he decided to establish a permanent base and work primarily in the southwestern region. It was during this period, in the early 1990s, that he met Marjorie Orban. She was a former dancer who had previously performed in the Foley's-Berg Volksshow in Las Vegas. After her career ended, she lived in Phoenix, in the Paradise Valley area, and was involved in home decor and event planning. According to those who knew them at the time, Jay was immediately captivated by her appearance and demeanor. He was attentive, calm, and patient, qualities that, according to his acquaintances, balanced Marjorie's character, which was known for its expressiveness and desire for luxury. They married in 1994 and had a son a year later. For the next 10 years, the family lived in a 2-story house in northern Phoenix. Jay continued to run his business, often traveling on business trips in his converted RV. A large motorhome equipped for his needs, a sleeping area, safes, shelves for jewelry cleaning tools, and basic office equipment. He traveled across the country in this vehicle from New Mexico to Florida, attending jewelry fairs and private meetings with clients. The family's income allowed them to live comfortably: a house, a swimming pool, an SUV for Marjorie, and regular trips to restaurants. At first glance, it was a strong marriage, stable, based on trust and mutual care. Jay almost always informed his wife of his itinerary, warned her in advance when he would be back, and never disappeared without explanation. He was punctual, meticulous in his work, and respectful of his colleagues. He was often described as a person who could be relied upon. He kept separate but clear accounts of family and personal expenses, and despite being on the road for weeks at a time, he always kept in touch with his wife and son. Neighbors knew him as a smiling, friendly man who often mowed his own lawn, even though the family had a gardener. In early September 2004, Jay traveled to Florida, a state where he had several regular clients. The trip lasted just over a week, and he was due to return home on his birthday, the 8th of September. According to available information, he did indeed arrive home on that day. Credit card statements, GPS data, and cell phone signals confirmed his presence in the Phoenix area in the morning hours. That date became a key point of reference in the case. No one saw him alive after that day. At that point, no one knew that. Visually, nothing unusual was happening at the house. Neighbors saw the lights on in the master bedroom and garage that evening. The next day, Jay was not answering his phone. One of his colleagues noticed that he had not arrived at a meeting where he was supposed to deliver diamond earrings to a regular customer. At first, this caused confusion, but no alarm. Marjorie explained that Jay had allegedly gone to Tucson on urgent business. A day later, she repeated the same story. No one asked any questions at the time. He was a businessman, and business trips were part of his daily routine. However, as the days passed, Marjorie's behavior became increasingly strange. She showed no concern and made no attempt to report him missing. When his sister contacted her, worried about the lack of communication, Marjorie simply replied that Jay was busy and would be in touch soon. But he didn't show up. After several days with no word, Jay's friend called the police. Visually, the house appeared to be in order. Jay's car was in the driveway as usual. The lawn was mowed. The windows were clean and the pool was full. But the most important detail was the complete lack of information. Not a single phone call, not a single letter, not a single transaction in his name, for someone whose job depended on constant contact with clients. This was extremely unusual. There were no signs of a break-in or a struggle. The police began an investigation, but so far have found no evidence of foul play. Meanwhile, against the backdrop of outward calm, something irreversible had already happened. The viewer doesn't know what exactly, but they know that Jay has disappeared, and this is no ordinary family episode. This is the beginning of an investigation that will stretch over many years and lead to the most unexpected discoveries. More than 6 weeks have passed since Jay Orban stopped communicating. During this time, the family continued to lead a seemingly normal life, and although tension began to mount among those around them, the disappearance was still not classified as a criminal case in police documents. No one had broken into the Orban home. There were no reports of suspicious activity, and officially, there was still no evidence of a crime. Everything changed on the 23rd of October, 2004. On that day, on the outskirts of Phoenix, in an area where desert plots intersect along East 40th Street, a man walking his dog noticed an inconspicuous industrial-type plastic container in the bushes. It was tightly wrapped in several layers of gray duct tape. The lid looked deformed, and there were traces of sand and stains on the sides that gave off a strong odor. Despite its apparent airtightness, the container attracted attention precisely because of this pungent odor and unnatural appearance, as if someone had hurriedly tried to disguise it but abandoned it near the access road without burying it or hiding it deeply. The man contacted the local police department, and officers soon arrived at the scene, examined the find, and called in forensic experts. The container was taken to a laboratory for examination and analysis. Within the first few hours, it became clear that what was found inside was related to the disappearance of Jay Orban. Inside were remains wrapped in several layers of plastic, showing signs of artificial processing and traces of exposure to temperature and chemicals. Experts later confirmed that it was the torso of a male without limbs, making it difficult to quickly identify the person. However, residual traces of fibers matching the material of the clothes that Jay was wearing on the day he returned from his business trip, according to his relatives, were found on the tissue. A few days later, a forensic examination confirmed that the remains belonged to Jay Orban. The location where the container was found was of particular importance to the investigation. The area where the discovery was made was located on the southeastern outskirts of the city, between residential neighborhoods and a few industrial facilities. This part of the desert was mainly used for walking dogs and as an access area for underground utilities. There was no video surveillance, no retail outlets, and no witnesses. The only trace recorded within a radius of 30 meters from the container was partially erased tire tracks and characteristic dents in the sand left by a heavy object, which experts believed had been dragged a short distance across the ground. These details confirmed that the container had been left deliberately, but in a hurry and with minimal concealment. It also suggested that the person who disposed of it knew the area, understood its isolation, but was not inclined to spend much time covering their tracks. By the time the remains were found, the Jay Orban case was formally considered an investigation into the disappearance of an adult male under suspicious circumstances. However, following the results of the forensic examination, the classification was changed to a criminal case with the wording "murder under unknown circumstances." This allowed the police to use more extensive investigative methods, including requests to banks and telecommunications companies and access to private property under a warrant. Despite the significance of the discovery itself, no direct evidence pointing to the perpetrator of the crime was found. The container was clean in terms of fingerprints. The tape used was of a type commonly sold in most hardware stores in the region. There were no hairs, skin cells, or fragments that could provide immediate results, either inside or on the outside of the container. Even the traces of chemicals used to treat the contents were commonly available. A mixture of bleach and ammonia disinfectant. All of these materials could be purchased at a regular supermarket without registering the purchase. Nevertheless, the discovery was of paramount importance to investigators. It not only confirmed that Jay's disappearance was not an accidental departure or voluntary departure, but also testified to the violent nature of the events. The very fact that the body had been dismembered and packed into a container suggested that the crime had been carefully planned and was not the result of a sudden conflict. The absence of other body parts also indicated an attempt to cover up the traces and possibly destroy evidence. The investigation gained new momentum but remained without a key element: a suspect. Marjorie Orban was not officially considered a person of interest. Her testimony was recorded, but no direct contradictions were found. She continued to claim that her husband had left town on business and had probably decided to stay longer. The police noted her behavior but did not intervene without a warrant. At that time, the press had not yet reported on Jay's disappearance, and the case remained within a narrow professional circle. From that moment on, the investigation moved beyond speculation and guesswork. The police now had confirmation of a crime, but no means of reconstructing it accurately. Who could have done it? Why? How did they remove the body? And why did they choose this particular method of disposing of the evidence? All these questions remained unanswered. The investigation was at a dead end. There were no witnesses, no cameras, no phone calls, or suspicious activity that could shed light on what had happened. The investigators had a body, but no name. After the container with Jay Orban's remains was found, the investigation went into high gear. Although there were no direct clues at the scene pointing to anyone involved in the crime, the detectives knew that the only way forward was to carefully analyze the facts surrounding the disappearance. The police began examining digital traces, phone calls, bank card movements, and communication device activity. The work to reconstruct routes and timelines began with an analysis of Jay's phone activity. Using cell tower data, investigators reconstructed a picture of his movements during the last day before his disappearance. According to records, his cell phone connected to a home cell tower in northern Phoenix on the night of the 8th of September, which coincided with his return from a business trip. However, the next day the phone signal stopped and movement data ceased. Despite the absence of incoming or outgoing calls from Jay himself, his cell phone was reactivated a few days later, but in a different part of the city. The device turned on briefly, registering on the network, and then turned off again. This happened twice, on the 10th of September and 12. Suspicion was aroused by the fact that Jay's credit card was used at a household goods store at the same time. A review of surveillance camera footage confirmed that the card was used to purchase items that in themselves would not have attracted attention: a multi-purpose cleaning product, storage containers, a canister of bleach, and protective gloves. However, the fact that the purchaser was a woman who resembled Marjorie Orban led investigators to record this transaction as a significant detail. At the same time, analysis of GPS logs recorded on the router of Jay's RV's built-in system revealed unusual data. Signals believed to have originated from the vehicle were recorded within the city limits between the 9th of September and 14. However, none of Marjorie's explanations mentioned the use of her husband's car during this period. Surveillance cameras from a private parking lot recorded the same RV parked outside Orban's home, several days after Jay's official date of disappearance. A woman was behind the wheel of the vehicle. The images were not clear enough to serve as direct evidence, but one of the cameras located on a neighboring house recorded a short clip showing the same woman getting out of the vehicle, opening the gate, and entering the yard. Experts who studied the video noted similarities between her and Marjorie in terms of build and manner of movement. At this stage, the investigation moved on to analyzing the financial transactions and behavior of family members after the disappearance. Between the 9th of September and 18, approximately $15,000 was transferred from joint accounts to which Marjorie had access. The money was used to pay for household needs, cosmetic procedures, and private purchases, including services to install new flooring in the garage. At the same time, Marjorie began actively selling items from her husband's jewelry collection, claiming that he had left her the right to dispose of them during his absence. At the same time, investigators began looking into Marjorie's background. They examined her previous relationships, social connections, and financial situation. They found out she'd been involved with a bunch of guys, some of whom she'd been seeing during the last few years of her marriage. One person they talked to said Marjorie had mentioned her family problems and said she'd soon be free to do whatever she wanted. The financial picture also turned out to be unstable. Despite her apparent prosperity, Marjorie had several overdue loans for cosmetic services, significant expenses for fitness, and debts on personal loans taken out without her husband's knowledge. Investigators noted that in the 6 months before Jay's disappearance, his wife had shown an increased interest in household chemicals and had repeatedly changed suppliers of household goods, preferring stores that did not require customer registration. This was consistent with a pattern of behavior in which a person prepares a plan in advance, avoiding possible digital traces. Her routes, recorded by cell phone towers, also showed a number of night trips outside the city, coinciding with the activation of Jay's phone. However, this was not enough to proceed with charges. During this period, the investigation was in the evidence-gathering phase. There was more evidence, but it remained circumstantial, comparing routes, analyzing purchases, studying behavior. All of this was pieced together into a logical chain, but it did not have the legal weight to bring charges. The prosecution demanded more: material evidence, traces, biological remains, direct matches. Investigators continued to work in the shadows, tracking Marjorie, recording her every move, checking every transaction. They waited for the moment when doubt would turn into fact. For now, the case remained unsolved. Formally, it was open. There were no witnesses, no confessions, no obvious mistakes on the part of the suspect. There was only a feeling that the truth was close, very close. In the spring of 2005, the investigation into the Jay Orban case reached a point where the only thing left was to find direct, material evidence. After months of painstaking analysis, route monitoring, financial activity research, and observation of Marjorie Orban's behavior, the police obtained a search warrant for a house in northern Phoenix. The decision was made after the prosecutor's office approved a request for additional forensic measures. The task force began the search on the 15th of June, 2005. The main task was to examine the garage, the surrounding area, the water supply, and the internal channels of the building, areas that could contain residual traces of physical activity related to the concealment of a body. It was in the garage, with the help of forensic experts from the Maricopa County Forensic Science Division, that traces were found that changed the course of the investigation. Using chemical reagents and fluorescent lighting, the experts recorded microscopic traces of biological origin on the concrete surface and in the drainage channels leading under the foundation of the building. At first glance, these could have been accidental contamination, but analysis revealed the presence of blood and tissue fragments. The material was sent for laboratory testing, including comparison with DNA previously extracted from remains found in the container. A few days later, official confirmation was received. The samples belonged to Jay Orban. This meant that part of the events leading to his death had taken place in the garage of the family home. At the same time, digital technology experts completed the recovery of data from Marjorie's personal computer. During the analysis, previously deleted browser history fragments, temporary files, and residual fragments from the system memory were extracted. Among the recovered data were search queries dated late August and early September 2004. The queries included: how long does a body take to decompose in the desert? How to remove the smell of biological remains? How to wrap dense objects for airtightness? And where to buy a container with a tight lid without registration. This data, combined with actual purchases recorded on Jay's credit card, supported the theory that she was preparing for a crime. Additional attention was drawn to the fact that Marjorie repeatedly provided investigators with versions of events that were not corroborated by any witnesses in the weeks following her husband's disappearance. She claimed that Jay had left town on his own accord, allegedly to settle business with partners. But none of these partners confirmed such a trip. In addition, a surveillance camera installed on a neighboring house confirmed that between the 9th of September and 2004, it was Marjorie who parked Jay's car at the house, even though he was already officially listed as missing. Based on the accumulated evidence and with the approval of the Maricopa County District Attorney, on the 29th of June 2005, the police issued an arrest warrant for Marjorie Orban. On the same day at 6:40 a.m., a task force arrived at the house to make the arrest. The arrest went smoothly. Marjorie was detained on the porch of the house when, according to preliminary information, she was about to leave for a visit to the fitness center. She was informed of the grounds for her arrest and then taken to the county department's temporary detention facility. The official charge filed on the same day included the wording first-degree murder with aggravating circumstances. The indictment included information about prior preparation, the use of means to conceal evidence, false information provided to investigators, and attempts to obstruct the investigation. It was emphasized that the defendant's actions were aimed at obtaining financial gain by eliminating her husband and subsequently disposing of his property without legal grounds. After her arrest, the case received widespread coverage in the regional media. Several news agencies, including local television stations, reported on the arrest. Articles and broadcasts highlighted the apparent discrepancy between Marjorie's image and the seriousness of the charges against her. The public was surprised to learn that an attractive, well-groomed woman, mother of a young child and former actress, was at the center of a murder case. However, as journalists pointed out, behind the facade lay a deep conflict that has now become the subject of intense scrutiny by law enforcement and the courts. After the arrest was officially registered, preparations began to transfer the case to court. Investigators, together with the prosecutor's office, compiled a dossier containing more than 300 pages of materials, photographs from the scene, video recordings, transaction data, GPS route printouts, full expert reports, as well as surveillance reports and witness statements. Particular attention was paid to the legal integrity of the evidence collection. All evidence was accompanied by formal confirmations, expert signatures, and procedural documents. The district prosecutor requested a preliminary hearing to determine the composition of the jury and set a date for the start of the trial. It was expected that the defense would insist on the lack of a direct link between the defendant and the place of Jay's death, as well as the absence of witnesses to the crime. However, given the volume of evidence gathered, the prosecution's case was considered strong enough to bring the case to trial. The trial of Marjorie Orban began in March 2008 in the Maricopa County Courthouse, located in central Phoenix. It was one of the longest and most expensive trials in Arizona criminal history at the time. The case file was voluminous, the evidence was extensive, and the attention of the press and the public was constant. The trial attracted attention not only because of its complexity, but also because of the psychological contrast between the image of the defendant and the severity of the charges against her. On the one hand, she was a well-groomed, self-confident woman, a mother and a former performer. On the other, she was accused of the cold-blooded, premeditated murder of her husband. More than 80 witnesses were called to the courtroom, including relatives, former partners, neighbors, store employees, and technical and forensic experts who participated in the analysis of the evidence. One of the key elements of the prosecution's strategy was to demonstrate the step-by-step construction of the criminal plan, from digital traces on the internet and the purchase of materials to attempts to hide the body and cover up financial transactions. The prosecution team presented reconstructed search queries from Marjorie's computer, receipts from stores where she had shopped, and photographs confirming the presence of biological traces in the garage. The forensic medical examination added further weight to the case. Although only the torso was found, experts concluded that brutal physical force and electric tools had been used. Confirmed DNA matches with material found in the home's drainage system supported the conclusion that the key events took place in a room controlled by the defendant. Psychologists involved in the case described Marjorie's behavior as cold-blooded, pragmatic, and devoid of signs of emotional instability at the time of the alleged crime. According to the prosecution, this only reinforced the seriousness of the charge. The act was not committed on impulse, but as part of a premeditated plan. The jury paid particular attention to the defendant's behavior after her husband's disappearance. The defense tried to portray Marjorie's actions as the reaction of a frightened woman who found herself in an uncertain situation and did not know what to do. However, documents showing multiple transfers from Jay Orban's accounts, active disposal of his property, and the provision of false information about her husband's whereabouts at the time he was already dead undermined this version. One of the prosecution witnesses, Marjorie's former partner, testified about her intention to get out of the marriage at any cost, which was also recorded in the minutes and included in the prosecutor's closing statement. The defense, in turn, insisted that there was no direct evidence of Marjorie's involvement in Jay's death. She did not confess to the crime, refused to cooperate with the authorities, and her lawyers claimed that there was insufficient evidence to convict her of the most serious charges. They emphasized the lack of witnesses to the crime, the incompleteness of the remains found, and the inability to accurately determine the cause of death. In addition, the lawyers tried to shift the focus to the possible involvement of third parties, citing Jay Orban's allegedly unstable business relationships. However, this version was not supported by either the facts or expert opinions. The trial lasted more than 8 months. Hearings were held regularly, and some episodes sparked widespread discussion in the local media, especially on days when surveillance camera footage was shown and key fragments of internet searches were reproduced. Reporters were often present in the courtroom, but due to the specific nature of the case, video recording in the courtroom was restricted. Reports were delayed and based on court transcripts. The final stage of the trial began in September 2009, when both sides presented their closing statements. The prosecution characterized the crime as a deliberate, financially motivated killing committed with cold-blooded calculation. The defense again raised doubts that would prevent a unanimous verdict. After 3 days of deliberation, the jury reached a decision. This decision marked the end of a long investigation that began with a man's disappearance and led to the uncovering of a crime hidden behind a seemingly perfect domestic facade. On the 1st of October 2009, the Maricopa County Superior Court found Marjorie Orban guilty of first-degree murder with aggravating circumstances. On the 8th of October 2009, she was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Alicia Bromfield was born on January 3, 1991, in a small town in Illinois to a loving and supportive family. She was the youngest of 3 children, and her parents always tried to do everything they could to provide their children with everything they needed. There was always an atmosphere of love in the house, and Alicia grew up accustomed to helping around the house and taking care of her younger siblings, performing all her duties with joy and responsibility. Her mother was not only a source of support for her, but also a source of inspiration, and they had a particularly close relationship. Alicia grew up to be a kind and responsive girl, and despite her shyness, she was always called the life of the party in her family. She was an excellent student at school, always striving for knowledge, and she easily found common ground with her teachers and classmates. Pleasant and tactful, she was popular among her friends and remained the center of attention in her studies, despite her modesty. Her dream of becoming a psychologist began in her school years. Alicia was fascinated by how people can behave differently, what reasons may lie behind such behavior, and how to help people understand their feelings and experiences. This passion led her to choose a career in psychology and criminology. After graduating from high school, Alicia enrolled in university to continue her education and delve deeper into the study of human behavior. She chose to major in psychology and criminology, hoping that one day she would be able to use her knowledge to help people and uncover the mysteries of human behavior. School was an important stage in her life, and she believed that she could build a career that would allow her to not only grow, but also make the world a better place. However, along with her studies, Alicia realized that she needed to pay for her living and tuition expenses, so she decided to get a job. She got a job at Home Depot in the gardening department, which was her first serious experience working for a large company. Alicia approached her work with complete responsibility. She was not interested in this job as a long-term career, but it provided her with a stable income and a chance to meet new people and learn a lot. She soon established herself as a hard-working, attentive, and friendly employee. She had good, trusting relationships with her coworkers, and it was at this job that Alicia met Brian Cooper. Brian Cooper was 10 years older than her, and at first their relationship seemed strictly professional. He was her manager, responsible for the department she worked in, and the first person to notice her efforts and dedication. Brian was an experienced employee and well respected among his colleagues. He quickly became someone Alicia could turn to for advice and support, especially when she was just starting her career. His mentoring and friendly attitude did not arouse any suspicion on her part. Over time, their relationship developed not only on a professional level, but also on a personal level. At first, it was very innocent. Brian began asking her to hang out after work, talk about different things, and took an interest in her life and feelings. Alicia saw him as a kind and caring colleague. He often asked about her studies, helped her with advice on how to organize her work, and shared personal experiences, which made communication easy and relaxed. Alicia thought it was just friendly conversation, and she wasn't alarmed when Brian sometimes suggested spending time outside of work. Gradually, the relationship became more personal. Brian began inviting Alicia to lunch and giving her advice on how to handle various situations. He also started giving her small gifts, such as her favorite books or coffee during lunch breaks. Although this was all perfectly normal for colleagues, Brian began making hints that became increasingly obvious. He would joke about how they could spend time together outside of work. Alicia felt some tension but didn't know how to respond, as she didn't want to seem rude. However, it all started to make her feel uneasy. Brian continued to make increasingly persistent attempts to establish a closer relationship with her. He became much more explicit in his hints, and at times her unease grew. Alicia declined his invitations to meet outside of work several times, but he did not give up, sometimes even making arguments that sounded more like requests than suggestions. Although she always tried to remain polite and non-confrontational, she began to have doubts about his behavior. One day, Alicia received an invitation to a wedding in Wisconsin. Alicia thought about it at first. She thought the trip would be something unusual and decided to accept. She thought it would be an opportunity to relax a little and spend some time in a new environment. She did not expect it to be a turning point in her life. On the day she was about to leave for the wedding, her expectations were simple: good company, fun times, and a festive atmosphere. Alicia didn't think anything could go wrong. On August 12, 2012, Alicia left for Wisconsin. The trip began as expected, with a joyful wedding celebration. The wedding took place in a warm and friendly atmosphere, and Alicia was the center of attention, receiving congratulations and enjoying the moment. She was surrounded by good people and felt comfortable, unaware that this day would be the last of her life. After the wedding, as is customary at such events, the guests returned to the hotel to continue the evening in a more relaxed setting. It seemed like a simple continuation of the celebration, but at that moment, a hidden threat began to creep in. Later that evening, when all the noise of the wedding celebration had died down and everyone had returned to their rooms, Alicia should have been able to relax and unwind. But soon, things took a turn for the worse. In that moment, which seemed ordinary, her life suddenly changed forever, and a tragedy that no one could have predicted was inevitable. On August 13, 2012, the day after Alicia Bromfield was found dead, Wisconsin police began an official investigation. The beginning was inevitable. The death of a young woman, especially a pregnant one, cannot go unnoticed. Instead of returning to her hotel after her wedding, Alicia was found dead in a hotel room, and the circumstances surrounding the event raise more questions than answers. The cause of death is unknown, but it immediately becomes clear that this was not an accident. Alicia's death shows signs of violence, and investigators are certain that someone is responsible. The police begin gathering evidence, trying to piece together a timeline of events. The first step in the investigation is to interview witnesses and gather information about who was with Alicia that evening. Finding himself at the center of the investigation, Brian Cooper, her boss at Home Depot, attracts the attention of investigators. They begin to gather information about his role in Alicia's life and discover that at the time of her death, Brian was her immediate supervisor. Brian Cooper was a man who had considerable experience with the company and was well respected among his colleagues. He was known as a good-natured and friendly boss, but he was also very strict and demanding. At work, he was known as someone who was used to dominating and controlling others. However, Brian and Alicia's relationship was not limited to the workplace. When investigators began interviewing people, it became clear that their relationship had crossed the line from professional to personal. Many colleagues noticed that Brian was paying excessive attention to Alicia, which over time became increasingly intrusive and aggressive. It is known that Brian periodically showed his attention to Alicia, offering to spend time outside of work, and even tried several times to convince her to join him on personal trips. He offered her help, took an interest in her personal life, but at the same time sometimes made inappropriate hints about a closer relationship. Although Alicia rejected him several times, her relationship with Brian remained fairly friendly for a long time. From the beginning, she did not perceive his attention as threatening, as he was her boss and she believed that his requests were simply friendly gestures. However, over time, her perception of Brian changed. As Brian became more persistent and intrusive, Alicia began to feel increasingly uncomfortable. At first, his advances remained casual, but with each passing day, his behavior became more aggressive. He began to monitor her personal life, sending her text messages and calling her for no reason, even when it was not work. It became increasingly intrusive, and although Alicia complained about it to her colleagues, she didn't know how to deal with it without ruining her relationship at work. Investigators began to discover that Brian didn't just limit himself to words and behavior, but also used his authority to force Alicia to make concessions. For example, after she refused to spend time with him, Brian threatened to cut her hours and later even suggested that she accompany him to his sister's wedding in Wisconsin, claiming that it was necessary for work. Alicia, despite her doubts, agreed, thinking that it was just part of her job and that nothing serious was expected of her. The day after her death, as investigators began gathering information about the incident, more details began to emerge. People who were with Alicia at the wedding said that, at the time, her relationship with Brian was friendly, although they noticed that Brian often paid excessive attention to her. Since they did not suspect any serious threat, no one could have predicted that the situation would escalate into something more dangerous. Alicia seemed calm and relaxed, and no one could have imagined that it would end in tragedy. Investigators began to develop several theories. They knew that Alicia was supposed to return to the hotel after the wedding, but she disappeared and her body was not found until the next day. During the first hours of the investigation, it was unclear who could be responsible for her death. Various hypotheses began to emerge, from voluntary departure from life to an accidental incident or even deliberate murder. However, even the very first analyses pointed to violence, which immediately ruled out natural causes of death. Investigators began to look more closely at Brian's personality and his relationship with Alicia. The more information they gathered, the clearer it became that his behavior was increasingly disturbing. He exhibited signs of control, jealousy, and aggression. As the investigation continued, it became apparent that his presence in Alicia's life could not have been accidental. Information that Brian had repeatedly attempted to physically assault Alicia and violate her personal boundaries began to raise suspicions. Investigators gathered evidence, including witnesses and text messages, that confirmed the manipulation and threats. All of this indicates that Brian may not have been just a participant in the events, but was likely the cause of the tragedy. At this stage, the theory of intentional murder begins to dominate. All the evidence points to his role in what happened, but no final conclusions have been made yet. The police continue to gather facts and prepare for an official arrest. The morning of August 13, 2012, brought an unexpected turn of events for investigators. A few hours after Alicia Bromfield's body was found in a hotel room, events took a dramatic turn. A man who was not yet a suspect in the murder appeared at a gas station near the scene. He was dressed in wet clothes, which immediately attracted the attention of the gas station employees. When the man approached the cashier, he uttered a phrase that shocked everyone present. He said, "Hello, I would like to report a murder." These words were the first step towards solving the tragedy that had occurred the day before. The man who uttered these words turned out to be Brian Cooper, Alicia Bromfield's boss at Home Depot. His confession came as a surprise and immediately raised many questions among the gas station employees. Cooper stated that he had killed Alicia Bromfield. This unexpected confession immediately attracted the attention of not only the cashier but also other people at the gas station, as such a confession could not be ignored. The police, having received information about the incident, immediately arrived at the scene. Cooper was immediately detained for questioning, and during the initial interview he said that the murder took place in a hotel room where he and Alicia had returned after his sister's wedding. These words completely changed the course of the investigation, as investigators now knew exactly where to look for evidence and what version of events Cooper was sticking to. However, what was even more shocking was the confession itself. The man unabashedly admitted to the crime. When investigators began questioning Brian Cooper, his statements began to raise more and more suspicion. Cooper claimed that he did not know what he was doing and was drunk at the time of the murder. He said that his relationship with Alicia was friendly and that he never planned anything bad. However, his story became increasingly strange as he began to share more details. Cooper admitted that his behavior had become increasingly aggressive and obsessive in recent time. He claimed that he had begun to feel control over Alicia and that his emotional state had changed when she refused to continue their relationship. He claimed that he could not control his emotions and actions at the moment when Alicia rejected him. Investigators began to doubt the credibility of Brian Cooper's version of events. His admission that the murder was committed because of drunkenness and accident did not seem convincing. Strangely, Cooper showed no remorse when recounting what had happened. His words sounded more like an excuse than sincere remorse. When investigators began to verify his testimony, it turned out that he was not as drunk as he claimed. His blood alcohol level was low, and experts could not confirm that his behavior was caused solely by alcohol. Even more alarming was that investigators began to find inconsistencies in his testimony. Cooper claimed that he was in a state of despair at the time of the murder, but his version did not match the evidence gathered at the scene. In particular, there were no signs of a struggle in the room where Alicia was found, which meant that she had not tried to escape or defend herself. This fact also cast doubt on Cooper's claim that the murder was accidental. Investigators began to suspect that Brian Cooper may have planned his actions in advance to commit the crime. Theories that the murder could have been accidental or the result of alcohol intoxication began to fade into the background. More and more people, including Brian Cooper's colleagues and acquaintances, began to recall his strange behavior in recent times. He had become increasingly controlling, his demands on Alicia had become aggressive, and her refusal to continue the relationship was taken by him as a personal insult. Colleagues who worked with Brian reported that he often made jealous scenes and exhibited signs of abnormal behavior. He could not accept that Alicia did not share his interests, and this caused him irritation. When investigators began to analyze Cooper's behavior and his relationship with Alicia more closely, they discovered that there had been many more unpleasant incidents than he had admitted. For example, Alicia had complained several times about his harassment and unwillingness to let her go home, especially if she planned to meet other people. Throughout the investigation, new evidence emerged that Brian Cooper was not just a friendly colleague as he tried to portray himself, but rather a man who was trying to manipulate and control Alicia. During questioning, Brian Cooper continued to claim that he was not aware of his actions, but with each passing day his story became less and less convincing. Investigators began to see more signs of hidden intent than coincidence in his confessions. He spoke confidently about how he had planned the events, how he had brought her closer step by step to the moment when she could no longer escape. This suggested that the murder was premeditated rather than accidental. Soon, based on the evidence gathered and witness statements, the police concluded that Brian Cooper could not have acted solely under the influence of alcohol and that his actions were deliberate. When Brian Cooper was arrested and brought in for questioning on August 13, 2012, his initial statement that he was drunk and unaware of his actions sounded implausible to investigators. They continued their questioning, gradually asking questions that forced Brian to reveal more and more grim and frightening details of the incident. Gradually, his story changed, and his confessions became more accurate and, most importantly, more horrific. On August 15, 2 days after his arrest, Brian Cooper began to reveal the true circumstances of Alicia Bromfield's murder. When investigators began to clarify the details of his confession, they realized that his behavior during questioning was changing dramatically. Now he was no longer talking about a random murder, but recounting details that cast doubt on his initial explanations. He confessed that he had strangled Alicia at the moment when she finally rejected his advances. According to him, the moment Alicia told him she didn't want to continue their friendship, his emotional state changed. He felt he had lost control of the situation, and, by his own admission, reality started to sink in. He felt that her rejection was a blow to his self-esteem and exacerbated his irritation. Brian admitted that at that moment he decided to act. Instead of accepting her rejection, he decided to show her that her refusal was unacceptable. After Alicia rejected his advances again, he began to choke her, preventing her from escaping. At first, his confession sounded like an attempt at justification, but as he opened up, investigators began to record more and more details that pointed to his intent. He said that when Alicia began to resist, he stopped for a moment, but soon continued, not stopping until she lost consciousness. However, the horrific events did not end there. After Alicia was strangled, Brian Cooper confessed that he continued his actions. He reported that after Alicia was dead, he removed her clothes and raped her body. This confession shocked investigators, as it not only confirmed his complete lack of remorse, but also revealed utterly depraved behavior that went far beyond simple murder. Brian explained that his actions were motivated by rage and anger that Alicia had not reciprocated his feelings. He admitted that at the time of the murder and assault, he had not thought about the consequences, but was instead driven by a desire to control her and her reactions. This statement showed that Brian's actions were not random or unconscious, as he had previously claimed. His admission that he had done it intentionally was a key moment in the investigation. Investigators who had carefully recorded all of his statements began to gather precise evidence that Brian Cooper was indeed guilty. His confession now became the main source of evidence for the prosecution. He recounted exactly how he had killed Alicia and what actions he had taken after her death. During further questioning, he continued to reveal details, confirming his role in the crime. His confessions included facts that could not have been known to anyone other than the perpetrator himself, which finally confirmed his guilt. One of the most disturbing parts of his confession was how he described his state of mind during the crime. He said that at the time of the murder and the assault on the body, he was under the influence of strong emotions, but was fully aware of his actions. He described how he felt powerful and in control of the situation when Alicia was unable to resist. He expressed no remorse or regret, only explaining his actions in terms of how he saw the situation and how he decided to resolve it for himself. This showed his complete emotional detachment from the victim. Investigators, of course, could not help but notice the oddities in his confession. Although they may have seemed sincere at first glance, the excessive detail and coldness of his account cast doubt on his motives. His confessions did not sound like the result of a momentary rage or a random burst of aggression. On the contrary, they pointed to a long, deliberate preparation and premeditation of his actions. Not only did he kill Alicia, but he also used her death to satisfy his sick fantasies. As investigators continued to gather information, it became increasingly clear that his confession of a drunken accident was completely implausible. He clearly knew what he was doing and committed the murder with a clear purpose, then went on to take even more horrific steps. This was confirmed by both his words and the evidence gathered. In addition, it emerged that throughout his life, Brian Cooper had exhibited signs of violence and harassment, confirming his inability to control his impulses. His colleagues and acquaintances recalled his aggressive behavior at work, his sexual advances, and his constant attempts to harass women. This behavior was well known in the company, but no one could have imagined that it would lead to such a horrific outcome. Now, investigators were confident they had enough evidence to charge Brian Cooper with premeditated murder. His confession was the main source of this evidence, and the investigation continued with a new understanding of what had happened on that fateful night. Everything that happened to Alicia was predictable and logical from Brian Cooper's point of view. She simply did not agree with his demands, and he decided that her life was worthless. After the investigation was completed and Brian Cooper was arrested, the case of the brutal murder of Alicia Bromfield went to court. This trial was a real ordeal for both the families of the victims and society as a whole. The murder of a young pregnant woman who had been planning to become a mother before the tragedy struck was a shock to everyone who knew her. Public opinion was extremely negative towards Brian Cooper, especially after the horrific details of his crime were revealed. The trial began in June 2014, and a great deal of evidence was presented in court, including Brian Cooper's confessions, as well as testimony and evidence gathered by investigators. The main focus of the trial was not only his confession to the murder, but also his continued denial of his guilt in the rape of Alicia's body after her death. During the trial, the prosecution sought to prove that the murder was premeditated and that Brian Cooper's actions could not be justified by alcohol intoxication or accident. One of the key moments in the trial was the testimony of witnesses who confirmed that Brian Cooper had previously exhibited aggressive behavior and obsessive behavior toward women in the workplace. All these facts, according to the prosecution, pointed to his inability to control his impulses and that his actions on the night of the murder were deliberate and planned. During the trial, Brian Cooper's defense team attempted to portray his actions as the result of a temporary loss of control due to alcohol intoxication, arguing that he was unable to understand the consequences of his actions. However, the judge and jury were skeptical. They focused on the facts. Brian Cooper not only killed Alicia Bromfield, but also continued to assault her body, which could not have been an accidental act. Brian Cooper's defense attorneys also tried to portray him as a man who was emotionally distraught over Alicia's rejection of their relationship. But these arguments failed to sway the majority. From the moment Brian confessed to the murder and rape, his defense lost most of its strength. All the facts pointed to him having committed a premeditated and brutal crime. Furthermore, during the court hearings, it was shown that Brian Cooper never apologized for his actions and showed no remorse or regret. On the contrary, he claimed that he had been wrongfully accused of what had happened. His composure during the trial only fueled public outrage and provided grounds for a harsher classification of his crimes. The trial lasted several weeks, and despite attempts by the defense to mitigate the sentence, the prosecution had sufficient evidence to convince the court of the premeditated nature of Brian Cooper's actions. The evidence included his confession, witness testimony, his behavior at work, and other materials that left no doubt as to his guilt. Ultimately, the court reached a decision that satisfied the prosecution's demands. Brian Cooper was found guilty of first-degree murder and sexual assault on a corpse. All the evidence pointed to the fact that his actions were deliberate and committed with a clear purpose. Verdict. On June 24, 2014, the court found Brian Cooper guilty of 2 crimes: first-degree murder and sexual assault on a corpse. On the same day, Brian Cooper was sentenced to 2 life terms in prison without the possibility of parole. Nicole Nikki Armando was born on November 19, 1988, in a small town in New York State. Raised in a middle-class American family, she always had a close relationship with her parents. But despite this, her childhood was not easy. Her father worked in construction and her mother was a housewife. The family was loving and caring, but as Nicole grew older, she began to sense some tension in her parents' relationship, which partly affected her perception of the world. She was the youngest of 3 children and showed great aptitude for physical activity from an early age, especially gymnastics, which earned her the respect of her peers. Nicole graduated from high school with good grades, but her family could not afford the expensive university fees, so she enrolled at a local college where she studied education and psychology. Gymnastics, a passion she had known since childhood, remained her main hobby and one of her sources of confidence. She soon began teaching gymnastics at several fitness clubs, where she met Christopher Grover. They met in 2008. Nicole was 19 and Christopher was 21 when they started working together. Both were gymnastics coaches at a local fitness center. Despite Nicole being younger than Christopher, she felt comfortable and trusting around him. Their mutual attraction became apparent almost immediately. With their shared love of sports and healthy lifestyles, their relationship developed quickly, and they soon began dating. The couple looked happy, and their relationship developed into a serious commitment. A few years later, in 2012, when Nicole became pregnant, they decided to move together to Salt Point, a small community in New York. It was an important decision in their lives as they began to build their future together. With the birth of their first child in 2013, their relationship grew even stronger, and many loved ones expected that this would strengthen their marriage. Nicole saw these events as the beginning of a new phase in her life, full of happiness and hope for stability. Christopher seemed devoted to his family, and they both felt that only happy moments lay ahead. Nicole devoted herself to raising her son and continued to teach gymnastics. Christopher, although somewhat reserved, supported her in raising their children, and their life became measured and peaceful. However, 2 years later, in 2015, when their second child was born, which should have strengthened their family ties, the situation in the family began to change. It was then that the first signs appeared that their relationship would no longer be the same as before. Christopher began to display frequent aggression. Not only was he cold and distant, but he also often lashed out at Nicole. She felt that she was losing control of the situation but did not know how to deal with it. The first incidents occurred when Nicole began to feel that her partner had become harsher and more aggressive. It started with small comments, but soon Christopher's behavior became more threatening. He began demanding sex from Nicole, and when she refused, he would verbally abuse her and threaten her with physical violence. She felt like she was losing herself and couldn't escape this vicious cycle. Christopher did not hide his dominance and gradually established complete control over her. At some point, he began filming her and posting the videos on various internet sites without her consent. These videos showed not only physical but also psychological abuse. Despite what was happening, Nicole did not dare to seek help. She was afraid that if she told anyone about what was happening, she would be accused of provoking the violence herself. She was also afraid of retaliation from Christopher, who often threatened her, saying that if she tried to escape, he would find her and kill her. Nicole tried to suppress her fear and continued to live with him, feeling her identity slip away with each passing day. In 2015, when Nicole tried to contact family services, she did not sign the documents because she feared that this would only increase the violence and lead to dangerous consequences for her children. Even after an affidavit describing the abuse was drawn up in November 2015, she did not dare to sign it. This was a time when Nicole was on the brink, and she felt that with each passing day she was losing her freedom and strength. The tragic day that became a turning point came on September 29, 2017. On that day, when Christopher was found dead in a house in Poughkeepsie, the situation became critical for Nicole. Christopher Grover's death in September 2017 was a pivotal moment in Nicole's life, turning her world upside down and calling all her actions into question. The investigation would later establish that this incident was not an accident, but the result of a long history of violence that led to a tragic end. On September 29, 2017, the day Christopher Grover's body was found, police arrived at the scene in Poughkeepsie, New York. The house where the tragedy occurred was located in a residential area of the city. Outwardly, the house looked normal, blending in with the other private homes. However, inside, the situation was completely different. It was a place that, as it turned out, had been hiding a long history of violence and fear that ended in tragedy. Law enforcement officers arriving at the scene found Grover's body lying on the sofa in the living room. He was dressed in everyday clothes, as if he had been sitting and relaxing when something happened. The blood covering the sofa and floor in the room testified to the severity of the man's injuries. However, at first glance, it was strange that there were no signs of a struggle. This alerted investigators. The lack of resistance or attempts to defend himself left questions that were not immediately clear. Grover did not try to escape or even defend himself, which could mean that he did not expect an attack or was unable to resist. According to a preliminary examination of the body, Grover's death was caused by a gunshot wound to the chest. However, upon closer inspection, the circumstances seemed less clear-cut. Autopsy experts determined that the shot was fired at close range, which could indicate that Grover was relaxed or even half asleep. This was consistent with the testimony of Nicole "Nikki" Adamando, who claimed that the shot was fired while Christopher was sitting on the couch and not expecting an attack. In addition, a weapon was found at the scene, but it did not belong to Grover. It was registered to Nicole, which contrasted sharply with the initial testimony. Nicole stated that she did not know how the weapon ended up in the house, even though it was right in the room where the tragedy occurred. The weapon was found next to Grover's body, but not in his hands. Fingerprints found on the weapon identified it as hers. This deviation from the standard pattern of events raised additional questions for investigators. The unusual position of the body, the lack of signs of a struggle, and the weapon found in the hands of the other party led investigators to seriously consider the cause of Grover's death. Initial assumptions of self-defense were ruled out by the lack of signs of resistance on Grover's body. While in similar cases, one would often expect to find at least minor signs of a struggle or attempts to avoid the attack, in this case it appeared as if Grover had been sitting on the sofa at the moment of the shot, not expecting any threat. Forensic experts who examined the scene confirmed that Grover did not attempt to resist or defend himself. He had no signs of a struggle, such as bruises or scratches, which usually appear in cases of resistance. He was not heavily armed and was not in a position that would have allowed him to prepare for defense. Some experts expressed the opinion that if Grover had been somewhat prepared for the attack, he could probably have defended himself, or at least warned of the possible threat. On the other hand, when investigators began examining the house itself, they found that it was somewhat neglected. Some personal items such as clothing and personal documents were scattered around the room, indicating a possible moment of severe stress. The absence of obvious signs of a struggle in the house did not rule out the possibility that domestic violence was a chronic occurrence. This was a turning point, as investigators began to suspect that the cause of the incident might lie in the long-term relationship between Adamando and Grover, in which violence and threats had become commonplace. After investigating the couple's personal life, the police learned that Nicole and Christopher's relationship was far from ideal. It became clear that their relationship was fraught with tension and hidden violence. This was confirmed by statements from neighbors and colleagues who said they often heard arguments and screams coming from their home. Particularly striking were the stories of sudden changes in Christopher's behavior, who, according to people, sometimes became overly aggressive and domineering. Investigators began gathering information about what had been happening in the home prior to the tragedy. It was established that the couple had been called to the police several times for domestic disputes, but there were no official reports of domestic violence. Problems with alcohol and aggression in the relationship were not documented, but neighbors' observations showed that tensions were growing. Thus, there was little room for illusions about what had happened. The investigation continued for several days, and investigators began to look at the events from a different angle. From the moment they found the weapon registered to Nicole, it became clear that the case was not as simple as it had initially appeared. Questions about how the weapon ended up in the victim's hands and why she apparently did not try to escape or defend herself became the focus of the investigators. Ultimately, the investigation into this case provided a complete picture of the relationship between Adamando and Grover. Police and prosecutors began gathering all available evidence to determine what really happened in the house on that fateful day. With each new fact and piece of evidence, suspicions began to grow. When the police began investigating Christopher Grover's death, special attention was paid to questioning his partner, Nicole Adamando. At first glance, her testimony seemed quite plausible. She claimed that a conflict had arisen between her and her partner, during which she shot him in self-defense. According to her, Grover threatened her with a gun, and she was forced to act to protect her life. Initially, Adimando's testimony did not raise any strong suspicions among investigators. Her story contained enough details for the police to accept her version as plausible. She described how, after another argument, when Grover, according to her, began to threaten her and tried to attack her, she panicked, grabbed a gun to defend herself, and fired. However, investigators gradually began to notice that her explanations were becoming increasingly contradictory. A more detailed analysis of her testimony revealed some inconsistencies. During questioning, Nicole initially stated that the shot was fired when Grover threatened her with a gun, but when investigators began analyzing her version of events, she changed her story, claiming that she actually fired the shot when Grover was in a relaxed position, sitting on the couch. This discrepancy in her testimony immediately caught the attention of investigators. While Adimando's initial claim that her partner had threatened her with a gun could have been seen as logical in the context of her alleged self-defense, the subsequent change in her story suggested that the defendant's version may not have been the whole picture. Investigators began digging deeper, trying to figure out what could have been behind the murder. They soon discovered that Adimando and Grover had serious relationship problems. For several years, their life had been full of tension and hidden violence. An important turning point came when the police began gathering information about the couple's personal lives. Statements from neighbors, acquaintances, and colleagues began to paint a very different picture from the one Adimando was trying to present. Some witnesses reported hearing loud arguments between the couple on multiple occasions. According to neighbors, these conflicts often escalated to shouting, and there were clear signs of aggression on both sides. In particular, employees at the local fitness center where Nicole worked mentioned that she often seemed tense and anxious. Her co-workers said that Nicole did not hide her fear of her partner, but despite this, she never sought help from the police. Nicole tried several times to avoid talking about her personal life, but she did eventually tell a friend about how Christopher abused her. It soon became clear that Grover's behavior left Nicole feeling completely helpless. Her statements increasingly showed signs of fear, paranoia, and despair. These emotional states were reflected in her accounts of what happened that day. She said she couldn't do anything but defend herself. However, inconsistencies in her statements about the incident itself continued to raise concerns. Upon closer examination, it was discovered that the gun used in the murder was registered to Nicole, which became another important element of the investigation. At this point, investigators began to piece together a complete picture of what had happened at the Adimando and Grover home. Through interviews and analysis of personal materials such as emails, text messages, and even photos and videos, it was determined that Grover had systematically threatened his partner. Some of these threats were extremely violent and directed not only at Nicole, but also at her loved ones. The relationship between them had become so toxic that it seemed the only way out for Nicole was to end the cycle of violence. On top of that, it was difficult for her to find a way out of this vicious circle without putting herself at even greater risk. However, the surprises that investigators encountered during the investigation did not end there. It became clear that in the weeks leading up to the murder, Christopher Grover had become increasingly aggressive, according to several people. His behavior became more unpredictable and dangerous. These changes were noticeable even to his colleagues and acquaintances, who began to notice that he often lost his temper and showed signs of instability. This reinforced the hypothesis that the murder may have been the result of years of pressure and violence that Nicole had been trying to cope with, rather than a random conflict. After gathering this information, investigators began to suspect that Nicole's self-defense story might not tell the whole story of what happened in the house. This led them to look at possible motives and how long her life had been in danger. With each new piece of evidence, investigators realized that this case was much more complicated than it initially appeared. The question of what had happened between Adimando and Grover became key to uncovering the truth and understanding what might have actually caused this tragedy. In the end, despite contradictions in her testimony, Nicole continued to insist that her actions were motivated by self-defense. However, investigators were increasingly inclined to believe that her actions were not only motivated by self-defense, but also by a deep personal drama that she had been experiencing for several years. During the investigation, it became clear that the relationship between Nicole Attimando and Christopher Grover was extremely painful and at times violent. With each new interrogation and piece of evidence gathered, investigators began to uncover a frightening picture of the couple's life, which at first glance seemed normal. However, as more became known about the personal relationship between Attimando and Grover, as well as what was happening in their home, investigators became increasingly aware that the tragedy that occurred on September 29, 2017, was the result of years of abuse, psychological and physical terror. In addition, investigators soon discovered that Grover did not limit himself to physical violence but also psychologically controlled his partner. Digging through the correspondence found on Attimando's phone, they came across numerous threats that Grover had sent her over several years. His messages included phrases such as that she would not be able to leave him and that if she tried, he would find her and kill her. These threats became more than just words, they became frequent actions. Grover systematically threw tantrums and started fights, making Nicole feel helpless and trapped in the relationship. In addition to this evidence, investigators found evidence confirming that Attimando had tried to escape this cycle of violence. She told friends and colleagues about what was happening in her family, but often kept the exact details to herself, fearing retaliation from Grover. Several witnesses, including co-workers, mentioned that Nicole came to work with bruises and looked depressed, but did not disclose the reason. One of her close friends, with whom she shared some of her experiences, later confirmed that she had told her about the systematic abuse by Christopher, but did not dare to go to the police because she was afraid that she would not be taken seriously or that she would be accused of provoking the violence. The next discovery made by investigators drew attention to a weapon found at the crime scene. It turned out to be registered to Attimando, which immediately cast doubt on the initial testimony. Nicole claimed that the weapon belonged to her and that she had used it solely for self-defense, but the fact that the gun was found next to Grover's body and not in his hands was an important piece of evidence that cast doubt on her initial version of events. This weapon became central evidence that Grover's death was not accidental, but most likely the result of Attimando's actions. When the police began gathering additional information about the family, investigators stumbled upon records made earlier. Photos were found on one of Grover's devices showing him committing acts of violence against his partner. These photos, taken without her consent, showed various degrees of humiliation and violence. Some of them depicted Nicole with her face covered or with visible signs of beatings. These photos were posted online and caused Nicole even deeper humiliation, which undoubtedly affected her psychological state. Elements of psychological abuse, such as public humiliation and extortion through threats, only increased the pressure on Nicole. And investigators began to understand that her actions may have been the result of chronic depression and stress. During the course of the investigation, investigators determined that Grover had become even more aggressive in the last weeks of his life. He was often unemployed and may have been suffering from financial problems. Nicole said that his emotional state had deteriorated and he had become more unpredictable. Ultimately, this also influenced her decision. She was faced with a choice of what to do to survive in a situation of constant abuse. Based on all the evidence gathered, including threatening messages, photos of violence, and the weapon found, investigators concluded that Christopher Grover's death was the result of systematic domestic violence and the actions of his partner, who at some point decided that her life was in danger and that the only way out was to act. This led investigators to conclude that Nicole Attimando was indeed capable of committing murder, but that her actions were likely motivated by long-term stress and threats from Grover. On October 3, 2017, a few days after the evidence was gathered, the decision was made to arrest Nicole. Police detained her at her home, and she was soon formally arrested on charges of murder. This event was a turning point in the investigation, as the court now had to decide whether she could be considered a victim of violence acting under extreme stress and threat, or whether she committed the crime while of sound mind and aware of her actions at the time. Nicole Adamando's arrest was the culmination of an investigation into the case that attracted the attention of not only law enforcement agencies but also the public. Many people began to wonder whether her actions could be justified on the basis of the years of abuse she had suffered, or whether she should be held responsible for the murder, regardless of the reason for her action. After Nicole Adamando was arrested on October 3, 2017, the case of her involvement in the murder of Christopher Grover went to trial. The trial attracted a lot of public attention because it combined issues of domestic violence, self-defense, and justice. The investigation continued for several months, and in January 2018, the trial began. The trial began with a thorough analysis of the circumstances of the crime, the defendant's testimony, and the evidence presented. During the trial, the prosecution presented a series of testimonies confirming the years of abuse Adamando had suffered at the hands of her partner. Based on this evidence, the prosecution sought to convince the court that the murder was not a random act, but rather the result of years of emotional and physical abuse. The defense attorneys focused on portraying Nicole as a victim of abuse who was forced to act under constant threat. They referred to the defendant's psychological state, arguing that years of abuse had led her to a state of psychological trauma, including post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, which could have affected her perception of the situation at the time of the crime. The defense argued that Nicole acted in a moment of stress, unaware of the seriousness of her action. It was also emphasized that she had no other choice, as she was in danger of being killed by Grover. On the other hand, the prosecution argued that the crime was not the result of self-defense, but rather a planned act of revenge. Prosecutors emphasized that the lack of signs of a struggle, as well as the weapon found registered in Nicole's name, indicated that Grover's death was not accidental but premeditated. They pointed out that at the time of the murder, Grover was not in a position to threaten Adamando's life, which cast doubt on the self-defense version. The trial lasted several months. During the proceedings, various witnesses were heard, including Nicole's colleagues, who confirmed her experiences of violence at the hands of Grover. Information was also presented about several episodes of violence in their relationship, as well as video recordings showing Grover's humiliation and abuse. Particular attention was paid to psychological evaluations. The experts confirmed that Nicole suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder and that years of abuse had had a significant impact on her mental health. This was an important element in the case, as the defense used these findings to demonstrate that Nicole's actions were dictated by her psychological state and not by malicious intent. The experts also claimed that Grover's constant threats and aggression led Nicole to feel that her life was in danger, which could have influenced her decision at the time of the tragedy. However, prosecutors objected, arguing that despite signs of past violence, there was insufficient evidence that Grover had actually threatened Adamando on that day. They pointed to inconsistencies in her testimony, as well as the fact that Grover did not resist, which could indicate that the shot was fired when he was unable to resist. This also cast doubt on the defendant's claim that her actions were motivated by self-defense. The trial attracted public attention as it touched on important social issues such as domestic violence, victims' rights, and justice. Many women supporting Nicole signed petitions in her defense, and the case attracted the attention of human rights organizations, which insisted that victims of domestic violence should be able to receive leniency in sentencing if their actions were motivated by long-term abuse. On February 16, 2018, a court in Poughkeepsie, New York, found Nicole Adamando guilty of second-degree murder and illegal possession of a firearm. The court found that the defendant had killed her partner, but despite evidence of years of abuse against her, the court found that Adamando's actions were not entirely justified by self-defense. The court noted that despite her traumatic state, at the time of the crime she had the opportunity to avoid violence and possibly leave the scene rather than using a weapon to eliminate the threat. On March 6, 2018, Nicole Adamando was sentenced to 19 years in prison on charges of second-degree murder. This decision was based on the seriousness of the crime, as well as the court's decision that her actions did not fully fall under the category of self-defense. Although the court took into account her condition after years of abuse, the decisive factor was that she did not take other measures to avoid violence. Gretchen Crane Anthony was born on January 8, 1969 in Doylestown, Pennsylvania, into a quiet and hard-working family that valued order and mutual respect. Gretchen spent her childhood in a small house in West Long Branch, New Jersey, where the streets were filled with the sounds of children laughing and balls bouncing on the asphalt in the summer, and the morning air smelled of fallen leaves in the fall. Gretchen's parents tried to instill independence in her, allowing her to learn to make decisions and helping her with her studies when needed. She attended Shore Regional High School, where she excelled, especially in the humanities, and often stayed after school to help with school activities, organize newsletters, and participate in volunteer initiatives that helped develop her sense of responsibility. After graduating from high school, Gretchen continued her education at a local college, choosing practical fields of study so that she could have a stable job and be able to support herself and help her parents. While studying, she took a part-time job in an office, where she learned how to work with documents and organize a workspace, which later became part of her life and helped her in her future career. Over time, Gretchen decided to move to Florida to start a new chapter in her life, find a job at a stable company, and raise her daughter from a previous relationship with care and love. Balancing motherhood with the need to provide for her family and maintain her inner strength in her daily life, for several years, Gretchen worked for a utility company, performing data processing and customer service duties, earning the respect of her colleagues, who noted her punctuality and ability to remain calm even on busy days. Among her colleagues, Gretchen was known as someone who was always ready to offer advice and help with work issues, while maintaining personal boundaries and striving to separate her work life from her personal life, so that she could return home in the evenings to spend time with her daughter, creating a cozy home and maintaining the tradition of family dinners. In 2015, Gretchen started going to the gym, where she met David Anthony, who worked there as a trainer. Their acquaintance began with short conversations after workouts where they discussed simple topics such as health, diet, and morning runs. Over time, their communication grew into a friendship that became the foundation for a relationship in which Gretchen saw an opportunity to find the support and understanding she so desperately needed during those years. David struck her as an energetic, active person who was able to inspire her with his plans for life, so in March 2015, they decided to get married in a small chapel in Las Vegas to formalize their union without any fuss, and then returned to Florida to continue building a life together. The first years of their marriage were peaceful. They spent their evenings together, took weekend trips to the ocean, shared household responsibilities, and sometimes David would bring home flowers after practice to make Gretchen happy. They also walked David's dog together, discussing plans for the future and supporting each other in their work. However, by the end of 2019, tension and misunderstandings began to arise in the relationship, which gradually led to the decision to live separately. In November 2019, David moved in with his mother, leaving Gretchen with their daughter and their home in Florida, and on February 28, 2020, they filed for divorce, maintaining formal contact to resolve property and domestic issues. Gretchen continued to work, support her daughter, and take care of the house, remaining sociable with colleagues and friends and continuing to plan small things such as weekends at the ocean or lunch dates with friends at small cafes in Abacoa. She tried not to show her anxiety about the upcoming changes to those around her, organized her home, put her documents in order, and installed security cameras to feel safer in case David returned for his belongings, as she tried to remain cautious in the face of changing circumstances. On the morning of March 21, 2020, in Abacoa, Florida, the air was quiet, typical of days when people stayed home because of the pandemic, and the streets looked empty and unusually silent. Gretchen was supposed to meet a friend for lunch, but she did not show up and did not answer several calls and messages, which alarmed her relatives and friends, who were accustomed to her punctuality and reliability. Neighbors heard screams coming from her house that night, in which a woman's voice could be distinguished, but they decided it might be a random argument or noise from the TV, so no one called the police or went to the house to check. The next morning, her car was parked near her home, but Gretchen did not show up at the car or get behind the wheel to go to work, which immediately caused concern among her colleagues, who noticed her absence and lack of response to messages in the work chat. By midday, her colleagues and friends began to realize that Gretchen had disappeared without explanation and without warning anyone about a possible trip or departure, and her phone remained unreachable. At that point, there was no information about what had happened, and no one could explain why she was not responding, but the inner anxiety of her family and friends grew, creating a sense that something serious had happened, disrupting the peaceful flow of her measured life and leaving her home empty on a normal Florida morning. On the evening of March 22, 2020, the anxiety growing among Gretchen's family and colleagues ceased to be just a feeling of unease and turned into action. After attempts to contact her were unsuccessful, the decision was made to contact the police to check her home in Abacoa, which had always been neat and tidy, with neatly trimmed bushes at the entrance and a bright door behind which Gretchen spent her evenings with her daughter, and the sounds of quiet music in the kitchen. When the police and relatives entered, the atmosphere of the house immediately seemed unusual, and this feeling did not come from disorder, but rather from a strange combination of orderliness and details that immediately caught the eye, disrupting the picture of familiar comfort. Inside the house, there was a smell of cleaning products that had been used recently, and this smell was unusually pungent, permeating the air and leaving a feeling of sterility, but at the same time creating a strange tension. At first glance, the rooms appeared to be in order, with everything in its place, but upon closer inspection, a broken frame was noticed in the bedroom, which had fallen onto the bed, leaving small shards of glass on the bedspread. The glass shards glistened in the lamplight, emphasizing that they had not been cleaned up in a hurry, but had been left behind after the fall of an object that had been part of the interior, now violating its function as a symbol of tranquility. On the bedroom floor, it was clear that the carpet had been recently cleaned, and in some places the fabric appeared damp, as if the cleaning had been done urgently and without thorough drying. In the kitchen, attention was drawn to bottles of cleaning products standing open by the sink, creating the impression that cleaning had been interrupted or completed in a hurry, leaving behind a smell that had permeated the air and was associated with an attempt to hide something that required urgent cleaning. These details were not something that could escape the gaze of the police officers, who recorded every little thing, understanding that these signs could become part of the overall picture that would explain what had happened in this house. The garage attracted particular attention, where the floor appeared to have been recently cleaned with detergents, and there were stains on the concrete surface that looked unusual and attracted attention due to their different color compared to the rest of the floor. These stains gave the impression that someone had recently carried out activities in this area that they wanted to hide, leaving visual traces that could not be completely removed even after wet cleaning. There were also drag marks on the concrete surface, visible as faint stripes left by the movement of a heavy object, creating a broken line from one corner of the garage to the other, which was recorded in the inspection report as a potentially significant element for further analysis. When the house was inspected, it was decided to check Gretchen's vehicle, which she usually used for work and errands. The car was found in the parking lot of a medical center in Jupiter, which immediately seemed strange, as Gretchen had not reported any plans to visit medical facilities, and also because her bag and cell phone were left inside the car, which she usually took with her, even on short trips away from home. This circumstance heightened the suspicions of the police and the family, as the presence of personal belongings inside the car and the absence of Gretchen herself indicated that she had not left voluntarily, leaving her car in a place where she did not plan to be, without explaining her reasons or warning anyone close to her. The interior of the car was tidy, but there were stains on the steering wheel and gear lever that stood out visually and could indicate the presence of biological traces. These findings were recorded in the police report and confirmed that the situation went beyond a simple disappearance and could be classified as a crime committed against Gretchen. The car door was locked, and the driver's side window was slightly open, giving the impression that the car had been left in a hurry but with care, not to attract the attention of passers-by. Police officers began interviewing neighbors to determine if anyone had heard anything unusual on the night before Gretchen's disappearance, and received confirmation from several residents that screams had been heard coming from her home during the night. The screams were alarming, but no one called the police, assuming they were domestic disputes or noise from a television that was too loud. This oversight added an element of tragedy to the overall picture, highlighting that sometimes people prefer not to intervene even when they hear screams, so as not to violate the personal space of others, but in such cases, delay can have consequences. By the time the initial examination of the house and car was completed, it was clear that Gretchen had not left the house of her own accord, and all the details found indicated that an event had occurred inside the house that had disrupted her normal routine and led to her disappearance. The police recorded all elements that could indicate signs of a struggle and attempts to cover up the consequences, realizing that further investigation would require analysis of CCTV footage, witness interviews, and an examination of Gretchen's connections in order to establish the exact sequence of events that led to her disappearance during those days when the city of Abacoa was living in unusual silence and the streets were deserted due to the pandemic. At this stage of the investigation, there were no suspects, no clear motive, and no one could say for sure who might have had an interest in Gretchen's disappearance. The only obvious fact that the police officers recorded and that her family and colleagues understood was that a crime had been committed in Gretchen's home, in her familiar and safe environment, and that her absence could no longer be considered an accidental disappearance. This realization became the basis for launching an investigation that would provide answers to the questions that troubled everyone who knew Gretchen, leaving hope that the truth would be uncovered despite the darkness that enveloped the house in Abacoa that day. After Gretchen's home was searched and the police recorded all the details indicating that a crime had been committed, the investigation focused on analyzing information related to her phone and email. On March 23, 2020, messages began arriving on the phones of family members and friends, supposedly sent on behalf of Gretchen. These messages said that she was forced to stay home due to the need for self-isolation, and therefore would not be able to communicate or leave the house in the coming days. The messages were short and contained standard phrases about the need to take precautions, but those who knew Gretchen well immediately noticed that the style of writing did not match her usual manner of communication. Gretchen usually wrote at length, always thanked people for their understanding, used polite phrases, and ended her messages with wishes for health and peace, whereas the new messages were dry, emotionless, and used general phrases that gave the impression of being formulaic. The next day, March 24, Gretchen's co-workers received an email from her stating that she would be absent from work for several days due to self-isolation related to the pandemic. The email was short, contained no specific details, and was written in a business tone that was not characteristic of Gretchen, who usually provided her colleagues with more detailed information when she was forced to be absent. This discrepancy in style and format raised concerns among management, who passed the information on to the police, realizing that in the context of her sudden disappearance, such emails could be part of an attempt to create a false impression of her whereabouts and condition. At the same time, the police requested CCTV footage from cameras installed in the Abacoa area to determine who might have been near Gretchen's home on the night of her disappearance. When reviewing footage from cameras installed on neighboring houses, images were captured showing a dark figure standing in Gretchen's backyard on the night of March 2021. The figure remained within view of the camera for some time, moving along the fence and periodically stopping near the windows, giving the impression that the person was carefully surveying the area and choosing a moment to enter the house without attracting attention. The cameras did not allow the person to be clearly identified, but they did record a time that coincided with the time frame of Gretchen's presumed disappearance, leading the police to suspect that this person may have been involved in her disappearance. At the same time, several neighbors told the police that on the night of her disappearance, they heard screams coming from Gretchen's house, in which they could make out words spoken by a woman's voice, begging for help. According to witnesses, a female voice could be heard uttering phrases that included words asking to stop, and a phrase that included a word associated with pain, spoken with anguish. These sounds were recorded in the memories of the neighbors, but they did not call the police that night, believing that it could be related to domestic disputes or other personal circumstances in which they did not want to interfere, considering that it did not require their involvement. It was only after Gretchen's disappearance became known that the neighbors realized that these screams could be related to the incident that had disturbed the peace of the street. The police, continuing to analyze the information gathered, contacted telecommunications companies to request information about the movements of Gretchen's phone after the date of her presumed disappearance. The data obtained showed that Gretchen's phone, despite reports of her self-isolation, continued to move around the United States. It was first detected in the Pensacola area of Florida 2 days after her disappearance. Then signals from the phone were detected at various locations in Texas, raising questions for investigators about how Gretchen could have traveled across the country if messages sent on her behalf claimed she was at home. This information contradicted the version presented in messages and letters and became an important element for further investigation, as it suggested that the phone was being used by another person trying to create the appearance of Gretchen's activity while concealing her actual whereabouts. In addition, analysis of phone data and camera recordings allowed the police to establish that on the night of her disappearance, there was indeed a person in Gretchen's house who could not be identified, but who was recorded in the area covered by cameras and motion sensors installed in the vicinity of the house. This information led investigators to conclude that an unknown person had entered Gretchen's home at a time when she should have been there, and that this event coincided with the moment after which Gretchen stopped communicating with her relatives and colleagues. This stage of the investigation became the starting point when the police began to understand that Gretchen's disappearance was the result of criminal acts aimed at concealing her whereabouts, and that further analysis of the evidence and collection of evidence should focus on identifying the person who used her phone and traveled around the country, creating false leads that only at first glance appeared to confirm her safety. After analyzing the data, the police were able to track Gretchen's phone across the United States, and it became clear that the messages about her self-isolation received by her relatives and colleagues were false and were being used to conceal her disappearance. The phone's location data indicated that it had traveled from Florida to Texas and then to New Mexico, which contradicted the information received by Gretchen's loved ones. This data became crucial in determining the possible route of the person involved in her disappearance and allowed investigators to begin forming a clearer line of inquiry. While checking the information, the police established that the car in which the person carrying Gretchen's phone was traveling belonged to David Anthony, Gretchen's husband, with whom she was in the process of divorcing. This information was made available to the investigation, along with data indicating that David had left his place of residence in Florida and left with his dog, heading towards the western border of the country. Police officers began tracking the routes David's car might have taken, contacting gas stations, hotels, and stores to confirm his possible location at various points along the route. During the analysis of the routes, confirmation was received that David had visited jewelry stores in various cities, trying to sell jewelry that, as it later turned out, belonged to Gretchen. In one of the stores, the salesperson noted that David was trying to sell women's jewelry, explaining that these items had been left behind by a woman who no longer needed them. This information raised further suspicions among investigators as it coincided with a period when Gretchen was considered missing and added to the overall picture of details pointing to David's possible involvement in her disappearance. Police officers continued to analyze CCTV footage from cameras installed near Gretchen's home to determine exactly who was recorded near her home on the night of March 21, 2020. Upon reviewing the footage, they were able to identify a figure near the front and back of the house, and by comparing it with other footage and information about clothing and build, they determined that the person was David Anthony. This confirmation became an important part of the evidence base, allowing investigators to connect the dots between the false reports, the movement of the phone, the attempts to sell jewelry, and David's presence in the area of Gretchen's home on the night of her disappearance. Inside Gretchen's car, which had been left in the parking lot of the medical center, traces were previously found that upon examination confirmed the presence of biological traces, consistent with data that could indicate the presence of blood. These traces were recorded as evidence, strengthening the investigation's theory that the car may have contained traces of an event related to Gretchen's disappearance, and confirming that attempts to hide the evidence were not thorough enough to remove all traces. Taken together, the evidence gathered, including camera footage, phone movement data, shopkeeper statements, and forensic results, allowed the police to form a reasonable suspicion against David Anthony. The decision was made to arrest him to prevent him from leaving the country and to secure the evidence for subsequent legal proceedings. On March 31, 2020, in Las Cruces, New Mexico, in the evening, police officers, in conjunction with local law enforcement agencies, conducted an operation to arrest David Anthony at a gas station where he had stopped to refuel his car and walk his dog, which was accompanying him on the trip. The arrest took place without resistance. David was detained at the entrance to the gas station store as he was returning to his car with a bottle of water and a bag of groceries he had purchased on the road. Police officers presented an arrest warrant, after which David was taken to the local police station for questioning and processing for subsequent extradition to Florida. During questioning after his arrest, David claimed that Gretchen had left the house of her own free will and was safe, adding that she had reasons to leave and hide without explaining what circumstances could have led to her disappearance. He also claimed that he did not know her exact whereabouts and that he was allegedly heading to the border in search of new opportunities. However, at this stage, the investigation already had sufficient evidence, including confirmation of his presence near Gretchen's home on the night of her disappearance, analysis of phone data, forensic results, information about his movements, and attempts to sell Gretchen's jewelry, to charge him with a crime related to her disappearance. After his arrest, David was placed in a temporary detention center in Las Cruces, where he awaited extradition to Florida. Investigators began preparing materials for the transfer of the case to court, compiling a final indictment and preparing evidence to be submitted to the prosecutor's office for further proceedings. At the same time, preparations began for the trial, which was to answer the questions that arose after Gretchen's disappearance and establish the circumstances of what happened, the reasons that led to the tragedy, and the extent of David Anthony's responsibility in the events that took place in Abuco in March 2020. From the moment David was arrested until the start of the court hearings, the investigators and prosecutors focused on analyzing all the evidence to ensure the transparency and validity of all the charges that would form the basis of the trial, and to give Gretchen's family and the public the opportunity to learn the truth about what happened to a woman whose life was cut short in a home where she hoped to feel safe. After David Anthony was arrested in Las Cruces, New Mexico, on March 31, 2020, and extradited to Florida in May of that year, investigators finished gathering and analyzing evidence, giving prosecutors stuff that showed he was involved in Gretchen Anthony's disappearance. Preparation for the trial included reviewing surveillance camera footage, analyzing phone records, forensic reports, witness testimony, and information about David's attempts to sell Gretchen's personal belongings after her disappearance. This material formed the basis of the charges that the prosecution brought in court, starting a trial that was hoped would bring justice and clarify the details of what happened. The trial took place in Palm Beach County, Florida, with representatives of the prosecution, defense attorneys, and Gretchen's relatives in attendance, hoping to hear confirmation that the investigation would establish the truth about the events of March 2020. During the hearings, the prosecution presented a consistent picture of what happened, showing surveillance camera footage that captured David in the vicinity of Gretchen's home on the night of her disappearance, as well as evidence found in Gretchen's car, including biological traces confirming the presence of blood. Letters and messages sent from Gretchen's phone and email were presented as evidence of an attempt to conceal her disappearance and create the illusion that she was self-isolating, which contradicted the facts and data about the phone's movements. The defense attorneys presented David's position, in which he insisted that there was no intent in his actions and claimed that the events unfolded under stressful and personal circumstances that influenced his behavior at the time. The defense emphasized David's mental and emotional state, stressing that he had not planned to commit a crime, and asked that his condition be taken into account when sentencing. However, the prosecution focused on facts confirming deliberate actions aimed at concealing traces of the incident, creating false reports, and attempting to leave the state, which, in the prosecution's opinion, indicated an attempt to avoid responsibility for his actions. A key moment in the trial was the conclusion of a deal between the defense and the prosecution, under which David provided information about the location where Gretchen's remains were found. Thanks to this information, in December 2020, her remains were found in an area located about 3 miles from her home, in a wooded area near a large shopping center. The discovery of the remains allowed part of the investigation to be completed, confirming the crime that had been committed and allowing the final case file to be prepared for a court decision. The hearings were conducted calmly, in accordance with all procedures, allowing Gretchen's relatives to speak and express their views on what had happened, emphasizing the importance of establishing justice and the need for punishment commensurate with the gravity of the crime. The relatives' statements were accompanied by requests to focus on Gretchen's personality, her life, her hard work, and her importance to her family, emphasizing that the crime had robbed them of a loved one, leaving them with deep pain and emptiness. On January 14, 2021, the Palm Beach County Court found David Anthony guilty of second-degree crimes related to the death of Gretchen Anthony and kidnapping. On the same day, David Anthony was sentenced to 38 years in prison. The life of April Kaufman began in 1965 in Atlantic City, in a quiet residential neighborhood where the streets were filled with the sound of bicycles and children's voices in the evenings. The family lived modestly. Her father worked as a storekeeper for the municipal government, and her mother was a stenographer for the city administration. But despite the ordinariness of her life, April showed an inner drive from an early age. She always wanted to speak and to be heard. At school, she quickly became the leader of all school events, took part in theater productions, and by 10th grade was already considered the most media-savvy student in the district. Teachers noted her natural charisma and keen sense of language. After graduating from high school in 1983, she easily enrolled in a local college and then transferred to Temple University, where she chose journalism as her major. She studied with enthusiasm, but her academic program did not prevent her from working part-time. In the evenings, she presented short news bulletins on one of the local radio stations. After graduating from university, April stayed in South Jersey. She hosted morning and afternoon shows on regional radio, conducted interviews with public figures, and hosted short segments on health, education, and family relationships. Her voice was familiar to many. It sounded warm, confident, and unforced, like someone you want to trust. Her life off the air was just as active, raising a daughter from her first marriage, participating in city initiatives, and organizing charity events. Her marriage to her first husband ended after several years, without public scandal, but with a difficult divorce. April raised her daughter Kimberly on her own. They lived together in a small apartment, and although money was tight, the home was always filled with order, humor, and determination. Over time, having established herself in her profession, April expanded her sphere of activity. She became actively involved with veterans organizations, organized events in support of women returning from service, and provided counseling on adaptation issues. It was during one of these projects in the early 2000s that she met Dr. James Kaufman. He was older than her, with an established practice as an endocrinologist and a clinic in Linwood. He was a reserved, rational, self-confident man. He provided counseling to veterans with diagnoses related to metabolic disorders and often volunteered. The first conversations between April and James were professional, then organizational, then personal. By early 2003, they were no longer hiding the fact that they were dating. Later that year, they got married. Their home became one of the most recognizable in the neighborhood. A brick facade, a long driveway, a well-kept front yard, and an American flag flying from a flagpole. Neighbors recalled how April would work in the garden on Saturdays while James trimmed the lawn. At first glance, they were the perfect couple. Each was busy with their own work, but they always appeared together at town events. Against the backdrop of Kaufman's calm and reserved demeanor, April shone. She was photographed, interviewed, and invited to appear on local television programs. She wasn't playing a role. She truly believed in what she was doing. She often said that her mission to help people was not a privilege, but a duty. She was respected in her professional circle. She received 2 honorary certificates from veterans organizations, and in 2010, she was thanked by the Women's Division of the National Guard. At the same time, she continued to host radio shows, covering local events, conducting interviews, and reviewing support programs. Listeners noted that there was always something genuine in her voice, informal and sincere. The family seemed strong. Kimberly grew up, got married, but often visited her mother. The house on Woodland Drive was always bustling with activity, evenings with neighbors, discussions of projects, weekend trips. James, although not a public figure on the same scale, seemed to her to be a reliable partner, practical, taciturn, but stable. There were disagreements, as in any family, but none of their close friends noticed anything serious, at least not openly. Everything seemed fine until May came. May 10, 2012 began like many others. April spent the night at home preparing for a broadcast and another meeting with representatives of a veterans organization. The housekeeper who helped her on Thursdays arrived a little before 9 in the morning. According to her, everything looked normal. The car was in the garage, the mailbox was empty, and the front door was unlocked. She usually heard the radio playing or dishes clattering in the kitchen. April often ate breakfast late, but this time it was too quiet. She went into the house and immediately sensed that something was wrong. The lights were off and no one responded to her voice. Going upstairs, she entered the bedroom and saw April lying motionless. She quickly went downstairs and dialed 911. A police patrol arrived a few minutes later. A task force was dispatched to the scene. An official investigation began, but at that point no one yet understood how deep the roots of what had happened in the house on Woodland Drive would prove to be. When police arrived at Woodland Drive on the morning of May 10, 2012, everything seemed normal at first glance. The front door of the house was ajar, and a housekeeper who had just called emergency services was standing on the porch. According to her, there was an unusual silence inside. She went into the house as usual, but when she didn't hear the usual morning sounds, she went upstairs and found the homeowner in the bedroom, showing no signs of life. The house, which the investigators entered, looked neat. There were no signs of a break-in. The locks were intact, the windows were closed, and the alarm had not been triggered. The room was tidy, with no signs of disturbance. The dishes were in place, magazines were on the table, and the curtains were neatly drawn. In the bedroom where April Kaufman's body was found, everything also looked calm. On the bedside table was a book, a glass of water, and a phone charging. There were no signs of a struggle in the room, no items had been turned over, and the furniture had not been touched. The video surveillance system in the house was partially functional. Cameras at the entrance and in the garage showed the arrival of the housekeeper, but the internal camera in the second-floor hallway did not record anything on the day of the incident. Experts found no signs of tampering, but the possibility of a technical malfunction could not be ruled out. The alarm system also did not record any unauthorized entry into the house in the 24 hours prior to the incident. Investigators thoroughly searched all rooms. The living room, kitchen, and garage were completely tidy. There were no open drawers, scattered items, or signs of forced entry. Food prepared the day before was on the kitchen counter, the floor was clean, and items were in their usual places on the shelves. In April's car, parked in the garage, there was a bag with things for the trip and a grocery list. The assistant said that the day before they had discussed Memorial Day events, prepared clothes for a TV appearance, and checked the guest list for a charity dinner. There were no signs of instability or disturbing behavior. April said she was in a good mood, organized as usual, and did not mention any conflicts. April's husband, Dr. James Kaufman, was at work when the police arrived. He was called to the scene and arrived an hour later. The doctor explained that he had left for the clinic as usual in the morning and had been unable to reach his wife, but thought she had left on business. Cameras at the clinic and patient statements confirmed that he was indeed at work at the alleged time. The police began standard procedures. They seized his cell phone, laptop, papers, correspondence, and data from his mailbox. Diaries, personal notes, and notebooks with schedules were found in the house. The last activity on the phone was recorded late in the evening on May 9. It was a short message related to organizing a meeting for a charity project. No signs of burglary, theft, or forced entry were found. Neighbors did not hear anything unusual on the night of May 10. All doors and windows were closed and the security system did not sound. The police had no starting point from which to begin investigating possible criminal interference. Initial interviews with colleagues, friends, neighbors, and volunteers painted a picture of complete calm. No one had noticed any warning signs in recent weeks. Her relationship with her husband was described as stable. Veterans organizations, in which April was actively involved, confirmed her full involvement in community work. On the day of the incident, she was scheduled to participate in the preparation of a large event, as well as a series of radio recordings. By midday, the district prosecutor's office issued a brief statement. "We confirm the death of Citizen Kaufman. An investigation is underway. Comments will be provided as information becomes available." This statement was the only official source of information in the first days after the incident. The District Investigation Department began analyzing digital traces, phone calls, emails, video surveillance data, and social media activity. A forensic examination was soon ordered. At that point, the investigation had no reason to believe that an accident had occurred, but there were no suspects either. A few days later, it became clear that the case would be complicated. Inside the house, everything pointed to the absence of external influence, and no one in the woman's circle aroused the immediate interest of the investigation. The next few days were spent trying to form hypotheses. The police made no loud statements. The first articles began to appear in the media with questions such as, "What really happened in the Kaufman house?" The public was waiting for answers. But after reviewing the materials, investigators realized that this was not a case that could be solved in the first few weeks. On the surface, it was a perfect home, a stable family, an active woman with an impeccable reputation. Inside, there was a mystery that had yet to take shape. A year passed. The calendar changed seasons, but almost nothing changed in the case of April Kaufman's death. The official investigation yielded no public results. The media gradually quieted down. New topics took over the front pages, and the public's attention shifted. The death of the famous radio host was mentioned less and less, and when it was often in the form of an unanswered question. There are no longer any journalists on duty on the streets of Linwood. The house, once bustling with activity, is now empty and up for sale. In the eyes of the public, the case appears to be frozen. However, behind the scenes, an event is unfolding that will eventually change its course dramatically. About a year after the tragedy, a woman walks into the office of the civil law firm Darcy Johnson Day. Her name is Kimberly Pack. She is April's adult daughter from her first marriage, works in education, is married, reserved, but with an inner tension in her voice. She asks to meet with the lawyers and during the first conversation utters the key phrase, "I can't accept that this was just an accident. I have no proof, but I'm sure it wasn't what it seemed." Kimberly says that the relationship between her mother and her stepfather, Dr. James Kaufman, had been difficult in recent years. Officially, they lived as a stable couple, but conflicts were increasingly breaking out in the family. She recalls conversations with her mother in which she mentioned tension in the marriage, arguments, and coldness. Sometimes there were threats. But at the time, no one paid much attention to these words. The reason Kimberly went to civil court was to prevent her stepfather from receiving payments on several insurance policies taken out on April. These policies, totaling more than $600,000, 0 cents, were activated in the months leading up to the tragedy. Kimberly considers this a strange coincidence. She claims that her mother did not discuss such large financial documents with her and would hardly have signed them voluntarily without discussion. Lawyers agree to take the case, even though at first glance it seems to have little chance of success. There is no official charge, no suspect, no criminal case, but one of the partners, Patrick Darcy, explains his decision simply: sometimes the truth isn't on the surface, and to see it, you have to start digging from the other end. Thus begins an alternative investigation, not as part of a criminal proceeding, but through the civil system. The lawyers gain access to records that are usually off-limits to investigators: insurance documents, correspondence, statements, and testimony given privately. They study April and James' personal and financial connections and reconstruct the events leading up to the tragedy, day by day, hour by hour. The first findings are thought-provoking. Among the papers, they find a biography in which James Kaufman claims to have served in the U.S. Special Forces. He said he had participated in military operations and mentioned his rank and membership in a veterans group. However, when checking this information, the lawyers find no confirmation. The official databases of the Department of Defense contain no information about his military service. Moreover, it turns out that he did not even undergo basic training. This fact in itself is not a crime, but it raises questions. Why would a person engaged in medical practice attribute a non-existent past to himself? Next, the attention is drawn to telephone records. Lawyers obtain printouts of Kaufman's calls for several months prior to the incident. Among them are a large number of contacts with an unidentified number registered to an inactive address. Such phones, known in professional circles as disposable, are typically used for short-term communication. The contacts continued regularly until the night before the tragedy. After that, there were no more calls. Another alarming fact is information about financial transfers and transactions related to a private pharmacy chain. Lawyers have found that Dr. Kaufman prescribed controlled drugs, including powerful painkillers. The drugs were passed on to third parties, raising suspicions about their further misuse. Some of the names appearing on the prescriptions are repeated, but these patients are not listed in public medical records. Connecting these facts, lawyers begin to map out possible connections. They manage to track down several individuals affiliated with one of the region's well-known motorcycle clubs, organizations that have been repeatedly mentioned in connection with illegal drug trafficking. One of these individuals, Ferdinand Augello, appears in semi-covert contracts related to medical care for veterans. His name also appears in phone contacts, next to the aforementioned disposable phone number. At this stage, the lawyers do not draw any conclusions. All materials are carefully collected and systematized. A civil lawsuit is officially filed in court. Kimberly Pack demands that the insurance actions be declared invalid, citing a conflict of interest. During the preparation of the case, archival evidence is brought to light and legal expertise is conducted. One by one, documents are gathered that together form a picture. Behind the outward facade of stability and respectability, there are circumstances that cast doubt on the impeccability of the company's reputation. In parallel with the civil lawsuit, lawyers are conducting their own investigation. They are holding dozens of meetings with April's former colleagues, volunteers, medical workers, and family acquaintances. Some of them recall that in the months leading up to the tragedy, April had become increasingly tense. She hinted at threats, discussed a possible move, and once even shared her thoughts about separating. At the time, these details seemed personal and did not go beyond friendly conversation. But now, in the context of new information, they take on special significance. One of the witnesses, a neighbor, mentions that a few weeks before the incident, she saw people on motorcycles outside April's house, whom she had not noticed in the area before. No one linked them directly to the doctor, but the time frame coincides with the period of suspicious phone calls. By the fall of 2017, the legal team has compiled an extensive archive. They do not press charges, but they pass some of the material on to the office of the new district attorney, Damon Tyner. After reviewing the information provided, he decides to reopen the case. The The civil and state branches began working together, cautiously, without public statements, but already in a new direction. And although there are still no official suspects in the case, there is a sense of change in the air. Kimberly's attention to detail, persistence, and independent investigation are all changing the trajectory. Now, the investigation no longer views April's death as an unsolved mystery. A structure is emerging, still incomplete, but with clear lines leading deeper. By 2017, the legal work that began with Kimberly Pack's filing had grown beyond a civil lawsuit. Step by step, from within the system, what could be called a complete alternative chronicle was assembled. Hundreds of hours of interviews, dozens of transcripts of telephone conversations, correspondence, documents, insurance records, and inconsistencies in Dr. James Kaufman's biography all ended up in the hands of people who had no access to investigative powers but acted with remarkable tenacity. The decisive factor was a change in leadership at the district attorney's office. In the fall of 2017, the new district attorney, Damon Tyner, reviewed the materials accumulated by the lawyers. He was struck not only by Kimberly's persistence, but also by the precision with which the logical argument had been constructed. A multitude of circumstantial details that, taken separately, could have slipped through the cracks. But taken together, they formed a coherent narrative. The investigation was officially reopened. The prosecution team, including the materials from the civil case, began to reanalyze James Kaufman's connections. It was soon confirmed that the doctor not only had long-standing contacts with members of a well-known motorcycle club, but also systematically prescribed drugs that were strictly controlled. These prescriptions did not correspond to medical indications, and according to witnesses, the drugs were distributed among club members for cash. Another discovery was the very same disposable phone that, according to printouts, Kaufman had used to contact a certain number for 8 months prior to the tragedy. The last call was recorded on the evening of May 9, 2012, less than 12 hours before April's body was found. After that, the number ceased to exist. Analysis showed that the SIM card had been destroyed and the device taken out of circulation. Then a man appeared whose name was kept secret for a long time. He was a witness who had previously been associated with the motorcycle club. According to him, in 2012, a man approached the club's leadership and asked them to resolve a personal matter quickly and quietly. The witness did not know the details of this request, but explained that it concerned a woman who allegedly posed a threat and could harm the whole scheme. In exchange, a sum of several tens of thousands of dollars in cash was offered. The witness claimed that a drug-dependent man in a difficult situation was chosen to carry out the task. The prosecutor's office also received information that there was an agreement between the motorcycle club members and the doctor. He provided prescriptions, and they provided cover. Over time, the motive became clear. According to several sources, April Kaufman began to suspect her husband's activities and seriously discussed divorce, in which she could have turned to law enforcement with information about the illegal sale of drugs. This, according to the investigation, was the trigger. The decision to arrest him was made in complete secrecy. In January 2018, early in the morning, a special unit of the district prosecutor's office, together with the district police, arrived at Kaufman's home, where he was under surveillance at the time. The arrest was carried out quietly and without resistance. James Kaufman was alone, and his lawyer was also present in the house. According to the investigation, he had been invited in advance in case of a search, which, as it turned out, was expected. An official representative of the prosecutor's office confirmed the arrest, adding, "The charges include not only actions related to the illegal trafficking of prescription drugs, but also suspicions of organizing a criminal conspiracy that resulted in the death of a loved one." The press release included the phrase, "organizing a death to eliminate a threat and preserve a scheme of illegal profits." At the time of his arrest, Kaufman's personal devices, documents, digital storage devices, bank cards, several phones, and materials related to his medical practice were seized. All of them were handed over for forensic examination. The public reaction was immediate. News of the arrest of a respected doctor who had been considered a model of stability and professionalism for years quickly spread throughout the county. Many were stunned. Until that day, no one had officially made any accusations. James Kaufman continued to work, although he appeared less frequently in public. His practice was shrinking, but the reasons given were standard: health, age, fatigue. After the arrest, Prosecutor Tainer held a press conference. He did not disclose all the details, but made it clear that the investigation had a structured evidence base that included financial documents, correspondence, witness statements, and technological analysis. It was emphasized that the investigation was not rushing to bring charges, as it was gathering information with the utmost legal precision. The court chose to remand him in custody. Kaufman's lawyers filed a motion for house arrest, citing his age and health, but the court considered the risks to be too high. He was held in solitary confinement under constant surveillance. The first interrogations were conducted in the presence of his lawyer. Kaufman refused to confess and claimed that he had no connection with any activities outside his medical practice. But the investigation continued. New details emerged, including links to other suspects. In early February, several more people were arrested, including Ferdinand Augello, one of the alleged coordinators of the group, which the prosecution now openly called a criminal organization. He was also charged with organizing and participating in a conspiracy. Meanwhile, the press focused on the question of who could have been the perpetrator. Only assumptions were officially named. The name of Frank Mulholland, a man previously associated with the club who had a drug addiction, surfaced in the case. He died in 2013 from banned substances. The evidence against him was circumstantial, but investigators were inclined to believe that he could have been involved in the direct execution of the plan. However, it was impossible to confirm this completely. So, almost 6 years after the tragedy, the case, which had been considered cold, was reopened. Preparations for the trial began. The charges against James Kaufman included not only professional misconduct, but also one of the most serious legal offenses: involvement in a criminal conspiracy resulting in death. After Dr. James Kaufman's arrest in January, it seemed that the most intense part of the story was over. The investigation, which had been going on for almost 6 years, had finally reached its key point. The court was preparing. The prosecution was gathering evidence, formulating the structure of the trial, and clarifying witness statements. The defense, in turn, announced its intention to contest all charges, insisted on the medical condition of its client, and requested lenient measures of detention. The court hearings were scheduled for spring 2018. In the corridors of the prosecutor's office, details of opening statements, lists of evidence, and access to recordings of seized devices were already being discussed. It seemed that for the first time in years, the April Kaufman case would be heard in a courtroom. The public was eagerly awaiting the start of the trial. The media followed every move, and lawyers made cautious comments. Kimberly Pack, who had not missed a single date, continued to believe that justice would be restored publicly in strict legal order. But that did not happen. Early in the morning on one of the days in February, guards at the Hudson County Detention Center, where James Kaufman was being held, found him unconscious in his solitary confinement cell. The facility's staff immediately called for medical assistance, but he was pronounced dead at the scene. A few hours later, an official conclusion was published. Death was the result of his own actions, without the involvement of third parties. No note or explanation was found at the scene. His lawyers also received no warnings or messages indicating that he was preparing for such an outcome. The fact came as a shock to both his loved ones and the professional community. Despite the seriousness of the charges, James Kaufman was expected to stand trial, where he could either refute the allegations or face punishment in the prescribed manner. His sudden departure left many questions unanswered. He did not admit guilt, confirm or refute the investigation's version of events, or make any public statements. The trial that everyone was waiting for never happened. The case against him was officially closed. But there were still other people involved, including Ferdinand Augello. a guy whose name kept popping up as the guy who coordinated the whole thing. He became the key figure in the case, and he was the one who ended up in the dock. Thus, despite the sudden denouement on one storyline, justice did not stop. The story continued, with a different main defendant, but still in the shadow of the woman who started it all, April Kaufman. Ferdinand Augello, a man with a notorious past in criminal circles, a former member of a motorcycle gang and owner of a small business in southern New Jersey, found himself at the center of a new trial. According to investigators, he acted as an intermediary between the organizer of the hit and the perpetrator, coordinating communications, passing on information, and providing logistics. His connections to people with experience in illegal operations were documented, and phone records, correspondence, and witness testimony allowed prosecutors to build a case based not on assumptions but on documented actions. Augello's trial took place in Atlantic County Superior Court. The jury heard testimony from more than 30 witnesses, and digital evidence, phone records, and financial documents were presented. The prosecution argued that Ferdinand knew what he was getting into and knowingly participated in a criminal scheme. The defense, on the other hand, argued that he was merely a random participant in someone else's conflict. However, the evidence was compelling. On October 8, 2019, the Atlantic County District Court found Ferdinand Augello guilty of conspiracy to commit murder and illegal distribution of prescription drugs. On November 22, 2019, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Jamie Hahn was born in 1982 in the small town of Chocovini in rural eastern North Carolina, into a family that valued hard work and respect for others. Her parents, Bill and Margaret Kirk, were modestly well off but had strong moral values. Her father ran an insurance agency and her mother taught elementary school. They believed that good deeds start with personal example and tried to instill this in their only daughter. From an early age, Jamie stood out among her peers. Her teachers described her as a sharp-minded child with a strong sense of justice. During her school years, she participated in local debates, wrote articles for the county newspaper, and organized charity fairs. As a teenager, she already said that one day she would change politics from the inside. This was not youthful bravado. Jamie knew exactly what she wanted. After high school, she enrolled at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, majoring in political science. There, she distinguished herself as one of the most active students in her class. Her name became well known in student circles thanks to her participation in charitable initiatives, election campaigns, and debate clubs. She often took on the role of coordinator in volunteer groups and spoke at panel discussions. She was respected for both her tact and her determination. During the 2004 presidential campaign, Jamie was already working on the campaign staff of one of the candidates in North Carolina. There, she first met Nation Hahn, a student and volunteer who was as passionate about politics as she was. At the time, they were just campaign colleagues. Jamie was a senior, experienced coordinator, and Nation was a junior, ambitious assistant. Their interaction was limited to work discussions and brief conversations between rallies. Several years later, when both had other relationships and more professional experience under their belts, they happened to cross paths at a seminar on electoral reform. Nation, who had since graduated from college, was working at an educational policy think tank, while Jamie was heading up the consulting firm Sky Blue Strategies. What began as an exchange of ideas quickly grew into something more. They were united not only by their political views, but also by their outlook on life. The values they lived by were almost identical. In 2009, they got married. The wedding was attended by a small circle of friends and family. Nation wrote his own vows, and Jamie wrote a speech that, according to the guests, made even the waiter cry. Among the guests was Jonathan Broyhill, a friend of Nation's since childhood, with whom he grew up and attended the same church. He was the best man at the wedding and later became a regular guest at the Han family home. Jamie and Nation's family life was filled with working together, projects, and endless discussions of new ideas. They didn't just share a life, they shared a purpose. Their home became an informal headquarters where activists would meet in the evenings to discuss campaign strategy and share news. The place was alive. Coffee was brewing in the kitchen, and sticky notes with reminders to call the congressman or check the bills were pinned to the board. Everything here was permeated with movement. Jonathan Broyhill became practically a member of the family during this period. Jamie invited him to work with her at Sky Blue Strategies, handling financial reporting for one of the campaigns. He often came in with his laptop and dinner to go, put a stack of papers on the table, and discussed business. Sometimes he stayed late to help check the spreadsheets. Sometimes he brought ice cream and put on old movies. He didn't seem intrusive. On the contrary, he was calm, delicate, and reserved. No one would have guessed that this outward composure hid an inner tension. By 2013, the couple was preparing for another important stage in their lives. Jamie was campaigning for one of the candidates for regional office, and Nation was developing an initiative related to young leaders. There was a lot of work to do, and the house once again became the center of all their efforts. In the spring, they decided to conduct an internal audit of all their old contracts for any accidental inaccuracy. It was at this point that Jonathan offered his help, voluntarily, without being asked. Monday, April 22, 2013 began quietly. Jamie spent the morning in downtown Raleigh, in meetings, discussions, and on the phone. Nation worked from the charities office. In the afternoon, they exchanged messages. "Let's have dinner at home tonight. John is coming over to help with the paperwork." At 6:40 p.m., a familiar sedan pulled up to the house on Treetop Court. Jonathan got out with a folder under his arm as usual. It was a familiar ritual. He and Jamie often went through reports in the evenings when there were no outside distractions. Inside, the atmosphere was businesslike. Jamie opened her laptop to check the spreadsheets, and Nation went to the kitchen to make tea. In the living room, they discussed old payments and checked the amounts. Everything looked like any other evening. Three people who had known each other for many years doing their usual work together. At first glance, there was nothing unusual about this story. The North Raleigh neighborhood was quiet and green, living at its usual pace. Dogs were being walked, lawns were neatly mowed, and it was a warm April evening. For Jamie Hahn and Nation Hahn, it was supposed to be another ordinary evening. Dinner, a little work, and maybe a couple of episodes of their favorite TV show before bed. But an hour after Jonathan Broyhill arrived, something changed. Neighbors heard muffled sounds. First, a short scream, then a loud thud, as if something had fallen. The living room window was ajar, and a woman's voice could be heard coming from the Winstons' house. At 8:17 p.m., Sandra Winston dialed 911 and reported that she could hear screams. Something was happening in the house across the street. It was very disturbing. Someone was calling for help. 9 minutes later, a patrol car arrived at the scene. The door was unlocked. The police entered and saw Nation Hahn in the hallway. He was injured but conscious. Further inside, closer to the dining room, Jamie Hahn was lying on the floor in critical condition. Jonathan Broyhill was in the room. He was sitting on the floor with his head in his hands. He did not say a word. He did not respond to questions. An ambulance took the couple to the hospital. The police seized items at the scene and took Jonathan away for questioning. The official report stated, "Serious incident in a residential building. Investigation ongoing." So far, no suspects had been identified. The night in North Raleigh began as usual. The yards were plunged into darkness, the houses had their blinds closed, and the streetlights illuminated the asphalt with a soft yellow light. It was a little after 8 when sirens were heard on Treetop Court. Several cars with their lights flashing stopped outside a 2-story brick house with white shutters. Police officers poured out of their patrol cars, professional, collected, but visibly tense. The call had been logged as a possible assault in a residential area with victims. The officers did not expect any particular threat, but standard procedure required caution. They approached the front door, which was unlocked. Inside, it was quiet. A man was lying on the floor in the hallway, wearing a shirt and with a bloody hand. He was conscious and whispered something as he looked at the officer who approached him. It was Nation Han. One of the patrol officers immediately called for medical assistance while the other entered the dining room. There on the floor at the edge of the dining table, Jamie Han lay motionless. Next to her was a dark stain on the parquet floor, a broken chair, and scattered papers. The room was filled with a sharp smell, a mixture of blood, hot plastic from the laptop which had been working just a moment ago, and something else that was difficult to identify. Panic. Against the wall, in the shadows, sat a third person, a man in his 30s. His face was pale, his eyes fixed on the floor. It was Jonathan Broyhill. He showed no resistance, made no attempt to escape, and did not utter a word. His hands were free but trembling slightly. The police approached calmly without rushing and led him to a patrol car, first making sure he was unarmed. He did not resist. The first officers to arrive at the scene did not jump to conclusions. It was decided to immediately block access to the house and call in the investigative team on duty. 40 minutes later, 2 plainclothes officers arrived at Treetop Court. Detective Justin Hill and Lieutenant Carla Mason, representatives of the Raleigh Police Department's Major Crimes Unit. Hill, a short, stocky detective with 20 years of experience, was the first to enter the house. He didn't ask any unnecessary questions. He carefully examined the hallway, then the living room, where the computer was on the table, and then the dining room. Every step was methodical. Meanwhile, Carla Mason talked to the patrol officers, checking their reports and making sure that any potential evidence was secure. The room was messy but not chaotic. It was obvious that there had been a struggle between the people in the house. Several papers lay on the floor, reports, printed tables, political notes. A document titled Q1 Campaign Reconciliation Etheridge was open on the laptop screen. A knife lay on the kitchen counter next to the sink. It was from a set that had been standing on the counter. Traces on the floor, dried drops, fingerprints. Everything was recorded in accordance with procedure. Forensic photographers began their work almost immediately, using white-numbered signs and placing them throughout the incident area. The crime scene was filled with the quiet clicks of camera shutters. The ambulance that arrived after the police worked in a coordinated manner. Jamie Han was immediately placed on a stretcher. Her condition was listed as critical. Deep wounds to her abdomen and shoulder, signs of significant blood loss. Nation Han was in more stable condition but also suffered serious injuries, presumably from the collision or struggle. Both were taken to WakeMed, the largest medical facility in Wake County. Paramedics attempted to stabilize Jamie en route using mobile equipment, inserting a catheter and starting an IV. Nation was conscious and able to give his name but did not respond to questions. This fact would later play a role in piecing together the timeline of events. While work continued at the house, officers began interviewing neighbors. The first were Sandra and Tom Winston, an elderly couple who lived across the street. It was Sandra who called the police. According to her, at around 8:10 p.m., she heard a scream and then what sounded like someone calling for help. A few seconds later, she heard a man's voice. There was panic. It was unexpected. At first, I thought something had fallen, but then it became clear that it was serious. The neighbor on the right, Holly Chen, noted that at around 6:45 p.m., she saw a car parked outside the Han home. She recognized the car as belonging to Jonathan Broyhill, whom she knew from previous visits. He was there often, especially in the evenings. Everything looked normal, she said. The guest's behavior did not arouse any suspicion. The police also checked street surveillance cameras installed at the corner of the block. The footage shows a silver sedan pulling into the street at 6:42 p.m. and stopping near the Han home. There was no further movement. The cameras did not record anyone else entering or leaving the house. This confirmed that only 3 people were in the house at the time of the incident. Detectives decided to seize the laptop, tablet, and both mobile phones found in the house. These devices were sealed and sent to the police department's laboratory for further analysis. The documents opened on the laptop attracted the most attention. Spreadsheets, reports, and letters dated several days before the incident. An unsent draft letter was also found, saved in a local folder. Financial review pending, immediate attention. The recipient's name did not appear in the draft, but the content suggested possible accounting irregularities. At that point, this did not raise any specific suspicions, but it was noted as an item for further investigation. No charges have been filed yet. The crime has been classified as aggravated assault with unknown motive. The investigation was just getting started. The morning of April 23, 2013, started with a quiet alarm at WakeMed Hospital. While doctors continued to fight for Jamie Hahn's life, police officers working at the scene began to piece together the first logical links in the chain of investigation. Nation Hahn, who was in stable but weakened condition, was briefly questioned in the presence of doctors. Detective Justin Hill entered the room early in the morning. Nation was sitting upright with a bandage on his chest and an oxygen mask nearby. He spoke with difficulty but tried to be as precise as possible. When Hill asked him about the events of the previous evening, Nation replied simply, "It happened suddenly. We were working. Jamie was discussing something. I was in the kitchen. Then, it all happened in seconds. I heard a scream. I don't remember much else." When the detective asked a follow-up question about whether he could identify the attacker, Nation shook his head slightly. "I'm not sure. It's all too foggy. I'm sorry." The doctors interrupted the conversation, citing the patient's physical and emotional exhaustion. Officially, the testimony was recorded as incomplete, with no mention of a third person in the house. The police had no grounds to make specific charges yet, only facts. There were 3 people in the house, 2 in the hospital, and 1 detained for questioning. Realizing that the key to the motive might lie not only in the events of the evening, but also in the preceding context, investigators decided to focus on Jamie's work. Through Sky Blue Strategies, she ran the campaign of former Congressman Bob Etheridge. And it was through this connection that Jonathan Broyhill came to the house. His involvement in the financial management of campaigns had been documented since 2010. He had access to all payment documents, reports, and accounting records. Jamie's laptop, which had been seized the day before, contained a number of open files, among which tables with the headings Reconciliation Q1 and notes Double Check, Discrepancy, and JB attracted particular attention. These documents mentioned transactions made on behalf of various individuals, but they were linked to recurring addresses that matched Broyhill's registration. Some amounts were of particular interest: $2,800.00, $3,500.00, and $5,200.00, all listed under external contractors. At the same time, Jamie mentioned unexplained debits in her comments. Detective Carla Mason instructed a police financial analyst to conduct an urgent reconciliation with the banks that served Etheridge's campaign. At the same time, conversations began with Sky Blue Strategies employees. The first to be interviewed was Emily Harris, Jamie's assistant. She described Jonathan as calm, a little withdrawn, but hardworking. However, she said that his behavior had changed in recent months. He had become more prone to outbursts, forgetting basic details, coming to work without his laptop, and asking colleagues to send him documents that he previously had direct access to. He complained about his health several times, mentioning that his cancer had returned. Emily did not ask any questions, taking his word for it. Her testimony coincided with what Justin Craig, another agency employee, later said. He also heard Jonathan mention his illness. He said once that his time was limited. We all thought it was related to his treatment. He said he didn't want anyone to know. The investigation team sent requests to regional cancer centers and large private clinics in North Carolina. The response was the same. No patient with that name was listed in their records. This aroused serious interest in the investigation. Too many people had heard about Jonathan's alleged illness, but no one had seen a single document. Moreover, a search of his apartment turned up no prescriptions, appointments, or packaging for specialized medications. The lawyers set up it all looked like a carefully maintained legend. On the same day, Detective Justin Hill met with Robert Manning, a friend of the Hahn family who knew Jonathan Broyhill well. They met at the office where volunteer meetings had previously been held. Robert himself contacted the police, wanting to share an important detail. He said that he had talked to Jonathan about his diagnosis on several occasions, sympathized with him, and once even gave him money for medicine. The amount was small, but the fact that he trusted him was significant. When Hill asked if he had seen any medical documents, Robert replied, "No, it was all verbal." I didn't doubt him. We were friends. This episode added another element to the picture. Jonathan not only talked about his illness, but also accepted help, both financial and moral, under the pretext of it. Against this backdrop, the police continued to analyze the contents of Jamie's laptop. One of the drafts found in the drafts folder was an internal memo titled "Financial Inconsistencies, Urgent." It mentioned specific dates, amounts, and Jonathan's last name without providing any context. The file had not been sent but was dated 2 days before the incident. This suggested that Jamie was planning to take some action based on the analysis of the reports. Perhaps to discuss the problem with her husband, perhaps with Jonathan himself. By the end of April 23, investigators had several pieces of information that did not yet add up to a charge, but formed a pattern of alarming coincidences. Jonathan Broyhill was at home at the time of the incident. His name appeared in documents with suspicious financial transactions. Despite all these circumstances, the official report still did not name a suspect. The investigation remained cautious. Police representatives at a briefing on the evening of April 23 stated, "The work continues. The circumstances and materials are being analyzed. Any versions will be announced only after the initial stage is complete." Meanwhile, the press began to speculate. The first discussions appeared on social media, but the names of those involved remained unnamed. The public knew only one thing. Something inexplicable had happened in the house where two respected people lived, and where everything had seemed perfectly normal until the very last moment. The morning of April 24 began with silent anticipation, but ended in a tragedy that could no longer be explained as an accident or misunderstanding. At 7:39 a.m., the Raleigh Police Department received an official report from Wake Med Hospital. Jamie Hahn had died from her injuries. Despite the efforts of medical personnel, her condition had deteriorated throughout the night. Doctors pronounced her dead from a combination of massive blood loss and internal organ damage. The news spread quickly, first through official channels, then reaching the media. Jamie's name was made public for the first time. Her death marked the transition of the investigation from the fact-finding stage to the legal prosecution phase. Almost simultaneously, forensic experts began their work at the city morgue. The report, prepared closer to noon, described the location and nature of the injuries. The conclusion contained wording that allowed for an unambiguous conclusion. The injuries were inflicted at close range, with a household weapon, with the direct intent to cause harm. Traces of a struggle on the body indicated an attempt to defend himself. The expert group noted separately that the blows were aimed at vital areas. This confirmed the theory that the attack was deliberate. At the same time, digital materials were being processed. The police department's cybersecurity service analyzed the contents of Jonathan Broyhill's phone and email. The browser logs contained searches made several days before April 22, how to disappear without a trace, legal ways to change your name, and traveling between states without documents. Some of these queries were deleted manually but were recovered from the system cache. Email correspondence also raised questions. One email sent a week before the events to a temporary email address contained alarming phrases: "I've lost control. Everything is getting out of hand. I can't hide anymore." A financial audit completed a reconciliation with election reports submitted by the campaign headquarters of former Congressman Bob Etheridge. Jamie's suspicions were entirely justified. The election account was the source of illegal transfers totaling more than $45,000, 0 cents. The transfers were disguised as payments for consulting services. Several signatures were found to be forged. A graphological analysis showed that the handwriting did not match Jamie Hahn's originals. Jonathan Broyhill was listed as the approving person. He signed the reports himself without management approval. The money was transferred to accounts registered in the names of third parties associated with him at his place of residence. At around 3:30 p.m., the police obtained a search warrant for Jonathan's apartment. The address was in Durham, North Carolina, a one-room apartment in a residential complex on the outskirts of the city. A team of 4 officers and a homicide detective arrived at the scene. Jonathan was under administrative supervision at the time, but had not yet been named as an official suspect. However, the results of the search put an end to any doubt. Inside the apartment, everything was neat, almost sterile. In the closet were 2 folders with medical documents, including copies of certificates with the logos of medical institutions where, as was later confirmed, he had never been examined. Upon closer inspection, it turned out that most of the seals were digital copies printed on a printer. Next to them were blank forms, brochures from cancer centers, and questionnaires, some of which had been partially filled out by hand. Among his personal papers was a stack of letters, some in envelopes addressed to Jamie and Nation Hahn. None of them had been sent. Almost all of them contained vague apologies, phrases about trust, feelings of guilt, and fragments presumably written in a state of extreme agitation. "I wanted to be better," one read. Another said, "I couldn't stop, I was afraid, I'm sorry." The laptop confiscated from the apartment showed activity on the day of the incident. Several files were deleted about an hour before the visit to the Hahn home. One of them was a text document titled Exit Plan NXT, which was recovered using specialized software. Inside was a list of possible actions: go west, leave a note, take only cash. There were also saved drafts of letters, including one presumably addressed to his parents. These materials were seized and added to the case file. At 6 p.m. that day, the Raleigh Police Department held a press briefing. For the first time since the investigation began, an official statement was made. Jonathan Broyhill is charged with first-degree murder in the death of Jamie Hahn and aggravated assault causing serious injury to Nation Hahn. His status was changed from a person in custody to a person under arrest. He was read his rights. He did not respond to the charge. According to officers, he behaved calmly during the procedure, did not resist, and did not ask any questions. Thus, less than 2 days after the attack, the investigation completed its initial phase. Evidence was collected. The link between financial fraud and the events of April 22 was confirmed, and a motive began to emerge. A trial lay ahead, but even at this stage, the public began to realize that what had happened was not a spontaneous conflict. It was the result of a well-thought-out, albeit desperate plan. A plan born of fear, lies, and mounting internal pressure. The trial of Jonathan Broyhill began in the spring of 2014, almost a year after the tragedy. During this time, investigators gathered an impressive amount of evidence. Financial documents, witness statements, digital forensics, medical examiner reports, and reconstructed correspondence. All of this material was handed over to the Wake County District Attorney's Office. The prosecution was led by District Attorney Douglas Fahey, a man with a reputation as a tough but level-headed professional known for his previous high-profile cases. Jonathan was defended by attorney Charles Pearson, who specialized in cases with psychiatric components. From the outset, the defense's position was based on the argument that the defendant was not in a stable mental state and was acting under severe emotional distress. The hearings were held in Raleigh District Court, Courtroom No. 3. The case was heard by a jury. Public interest in the trial was high. Journalists, Jamie Hahn's colleagues, former political campaign staff, and members of non-governmental organizations were regularly present in the courtroom. For many, this trial was not only a legal but also a symbolic moment, an opportunity to get answers to the question of how and why the tragedy occurred in a home filled with trust. The trial lasted 9 days. Over 20 witnesses testified during the hearings. Nation Hahn took the stand on the 3rd day, speaking calmly, pausing frequently as he recounted the events of that evening. He described in detail the moment when he heard his wife scream, rushed into the room, and saw her on the floor with a man they trusted standing next to her. He did not mention the man's name, leaving the fact of the attack to the investigation. Next to testify were employees of Sky Blue Strategies, friends of the family, and experts in digital technology and banking operations. During the interrogation by the prosecutor's investigator, handwriting analysis reports were presented confirming that the signatures on the campaign documents had been forged. The testimony of financial analysts confirmed the scheme for transferring funds to accounts, as well as Jonathan's involvement in preparing the reports that Jamie had tried to double-check in the days leading up to the incident. The defense attorney emphasized the emotional state of the defendant. Reports from psychologists were presented, indicating episodes of depression, high levels of anxiety, unstable sleep, and a tendency towards self-harm. The defense insisted that Jonathan's actions were not cold-blooded, but rather the result of mental deterioration caused by fear of exposure and a personal crisis. However, the conclusion of an independent forensic psychiatric commission presented in court indicated that the defendant was aware of the nature and consequences of his actions at the time of the crime. This conclusion became a key argument for the prosecution, confirming that Jonathan Broyhill acted with full understanding of what was happening, seeking to conceal financial crimes. The trial came to a head when the prosecutor presented a recovered document, Exit Plan, DNL, found on Broyhill's laptop, which contained a list of steps to disappear, including change name, leave without explanation, and delete evidence. This was the final piece of the prosecution's case, showing an intent to flee before, not after, the incident. After the trial, it took the jury less than 8 hours to reach a unanimous verdict. The courtroom fell silent as the judge read the verdict. On April 27, 2014, the Raleigh District Court found Jonathan Broyhill guilty of the following crimes: first-degree murder of Jamie Hahn, first-degree attempted murder of Nation Hahn, fraud using forged financial documents, and grand larceny of funds belonging to a federal election campaign. On May 2, 2014, Jonathan Broyhill was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Anastasia Kamlovskaya, known online as Anastasia Grishman, was born on February 12, 1996 in St. Petersburg. From an early age, Anastasia showed an interest in art and self-development. Her family was characterized by an atmosphere of mutual support and respect for the individuality of each family member. Her parents, despite their different professions, always supported her desire for self-determination and developed her creative abilities. Anastasia grew up in a stable family. Her father was an engineer and her mother was an elementary school teacher. Her parents paid great attention to their daughter's upbringing, instilling in her a love of learning and culture. From childhood, Anastasia was quite independent and enjoyed being creative and doing things that inspired her. She began drawing at an early age, which led her to attend art school. At school, Anastasia excelled academically and was sociable, but she always remained somewhat reserved and disliked large gatherings, preferring small groups. After graduating from high school, Anastasia enrolled at St. Petersburg State University's Faculty of Arts and Design, where she discovered her passion for creativity and experimentation in various forms of self-expression. However, despite her academic success, she decided not to pursue an academic career, choosing instead to immerse herself in the world of fashion and social media. This decision was a turning point in her life. Anastasia realized that her future lay in the creative industry, and she sought to find ways to express herself that would be directly linked to her personality. For several years, she worked as a model for various photo shoots and developed her blog, posting photos and reviewing fashion trends. She soon attracted the attention of major brands and began working with renowned photographers. At some point, Anastasia realized that her place was not just in photo shoots, but in creating content that would be interesting to her audience. She then began actively working on adult platforms such as OnlyFans, where she could fully reveal her personality and express herself through candid photos and videos. Anastasia also started a popular TikTok account where she posted videos about her daily life, creating an image of an independent and confident girl. Soon her content began to attract more and more followers, and she gained immense popularity among her fans. This success on social media not only became her main source of income, but also opened up new horizons for her career growth. Her life was filled with exciting events, travels, and meeting interesting people. She did not limit herself to modeling, but also began to master the role of a tattoo artist, creating unique works for her clients. Tattoos became another important part of her life, and she proudly displayed her work on Instagram and other platforms. Anastasia was passionate about her work and worked hard to build a successful career in the world of fashion and art. However, despite her professional success, her personal life was less stable. Her relationship with Dmitry Chernyshov, her boyfriend, was increasingly fraught with tension, jealousy, and misunderstanding. Although Dmitry also worked in the adult industry and participated in the filming of erotic videos, his attitude toward Anastasia's success and popularity on social media remained complicated and contradictory. They met through mutual friends in the fashion industry and began dating when Anastasia was just starting to develop her career in the adult industry. Dmitry was attractive and charismatic, and their relationship began as a romantic story of mutual admiration and passion. He was very supportive of her endeavors and became her partner both in life and in her professional life, appearing on set with her. However, over time, their relationship became increasingly strained. Dmitry's jealousy of Anastasia's success and popularity on the internet began to grow stronger. This caused many conflicts between them, despite their outward harmony. Anastasia, despite constant problems in her personal life, continued to work and build her career, but her relationship with Dmitry became increasingly toxic and problematic. On August 2, 2022, Anastasia Kamlevskaya, a popular model and blogger known on OnlyFans and TikTok, went missing. She last communicated with her loved ones and friends, but soon stopped responding to messages. This date became fateful for her loved ones and friends, who could not imagine that their dear friend and colleague would disappear without a trace. In the first few days, her friend tried to call her but received no answer. She decided to take a step that shocked everyone even more. On August 3, 2022, after several unsuccessful attempts to contact Anastasia, her friend, filled with anxiety, turned to the police. The investigation into her disappearance began only a few days later when they came to the conclusion that the girl had indeed disappeared and her life could be in danger. On August 10, 2022, after several days of searching and concern from friends and relatives, police officers arrived at Anastasia Kamlevskaya's apartment, located on Yuzhny Highway in St. Petersburg. The apartment door was opened after a friend who had been unable to contact the girl since August 2 called the police. Concerned about her disappearance, the friend decided to report it to the police, and a few days later, following instructions from the investigation department, the police went to the apartment to check. When law enforcement officers entered the apartment, they immediately noticed a strange atmosphere. The room was quiet, and nothing indicated that it was a normal, everyday situation. However, as they searched the premises, the police came to a horrific conclusion. Anastasia's body was found in the bathroom. The bathroom was dimly lit, which only added to the grim impression of what they saw. The body was lying in the bathroom in a completely inappropriate place. An examination of the body immediately showed that death had been violent. There were multiple signs of bleeding on the body, indicating that she had been seriously injured. Several stab wounds on the body became key evidence pointing to a violent death. Soon, after a more thorough examination, investigators counted at least 6 stab wounds that had been inflicted on various parts of the body. The wounds covered the neck, chest, and abdomen. This indicated that the attack had been swift and brutal. What aroused further suspicion among investigators was the fact that the body had been moved to the bathroom. This was undoubtedly an attempt to hide the traces of the crime and change the scene of the apartment. The body was moved from the place where it was killed and left in the bathroom. This act was considered particularly significant, as moving the body indicated that the killer was aware of his action. Perhaps the perpetrator was trying to hide evidence, or later suggest that the death was accidental or did not occur at the time of the attack. However, despite these attempts to cover their tracks, other factors at the crime scene became key. After a thorough search of the apartment, the police found no signs of a struggle. No items were found at the scene that could indicate a fight or resistance on the part of the victim. This circumstance immediately caught the attention of investigators. The usual scenario for a murder in an apartment is usually a struggle. Screams, damage to furniture or other items in the room with which the victim could have fought the attacker. However, in this case, everything was different. No broken objects or damage to the walls or furniture were found, suggesting that the victim had not tried to resist. Moreover, the absence of signs of a struggle could also indicate that the perpetrator was familiar with Anastasia and that she may not have expected the attack. An important aspect that the investigation could not ignore was the condition of the apartment itself. Externally, the apartment looked neat, with no signs of violence or broken items in other rooms. However, the presence of the body in the bathroom, as well as the absence of signs of a struggle, suggested that the victim may have been taken by surprise. The perpetrator may have carried out the attack when Anastasia was not expecting any danger, which suggests that she probably trusted her killer or was calm enough not to resist. Further investigation revealed that Anastasia often stayed alone in her apartment because her job required her to work long hours and spend a lot of time online. According to her friends, she often worked at night creating content for social media. It was also known that her relationship with Dmitry Chernyshov, her boyfriend, was complicated, and they often quarreled. These facts could not fail to alarm investigators. Tension in the relationship, jealousy, and possible personal problems could have triggered the perpetrator to resort to violence. Interestingly, despite the absence of signs of a struggle, Anastasia's body showed signs that she was in a state of shock at the time of the attack. The autopsy showed that Anastasia had no opportunity to react to the attack, which also indicated that she was unprepared for it. This added to the suspicions surrounding Dmitry, who was the last person she had contact with before her disappearance. The investigative team focused on establishing what could have been the motive for such a brutal attack. During the investigation, witness statements were taken and possible motives for the murder were examined. Since there were no signs of a struggle at the crime scene, and the murder itself was quick and decisive, investigators assumed that the victim had no opportunity or desire to resist her killer. This strengthened suspicions about Dmitry, with whom Anastasia was in a relationship. The bloodstains found at the crime scene and the position of the body in the bathroom also became key elements of the investigation. This gave investigators grounds for further analysis of all factors that could have led to such a tragic outcome. The police continued to work on the case, and soon additional specialists were brought in to help analyze every detail related to the murder. After Anastasia Komlovskaya's body was discovered, investigators immediately began standard procedures to solve the crime, including interviewing the victim's friends, colleagues, and acquaintances. In the early days of the investigation, most of the people interviewed said that Anastasia was a cheerful, energetic person, but that her relationship with Dmitry Chernyshov was tense. This was confirmed by both her closest friends and people who knew the couple. Already during the questioning, when investigators were gathering information about her life and possible reasons for her disappearance, the first suspicions about her partner began to arise. Anastasia's friends and colleagues noted that her relationship with Dmitry had become increasingly problematic over time. Some even mentioned that the girl had complained several times about her boyfriend's jealousy. The testimony of these people played an important role in determining the direction of the investigation. Some of Anastasia's acquaintances said that she had repeatedly mentioned that her relationship with Dmitry was becoming increasingly difficult, especially in the last months of her life. According to her friends, he was very controlling and jealous of every man she interacted with, which could have caused tension in their relationship. There was information that Dmitry not only suspected her of cheating, but was also extremely sensitive to her popularity on adult platforms such as OnlyFans, where she received significant attention from men. One acquaintance even reported seeing Anastasia and Dmitry raise their voices and threaten each other several times during arguments. These conflicts became increasingly heated and emotionally charged, and it was unclear how the next argument would end. This gave reason to believe that against a backdrop of jealousy, discontent, and constant conflict, an emotional outburst could have occurred, leading to the tragedy. Although the police did not immediately raise any specific suspicions, they began to focus on Dmitry Chernyshov. Initially, investigators focused on general facts and connections that could shed light on Anastasia's disappearance and death, not ruling out the possibility of an accident or misfortune. However, with each interrogation, it became increasingly clear that Dmitry was the prime suspect in the murder. He was the last person to see Anastasia alive, and his relationship with her became the main focus of the investigation. Particular attention was paid to changes in Dmitry's behavior after Anastasia's disappearance. This behavior became a clear indicator that his involvement in the murder might be more obvious than initially thought. In the days following her disappearance, while friends and police began searching for Anastasia, Dmitry continued to actively correspond with her followers on social media. He used Anastasia's phone and responded to messages on her behalf. His actions raised suspicions as, despite the tragedy, he did not report her disappearance to the police and continued to behave as if everything was fine with the girl. It soon became clear that Dmitry was not just responding to messages but also interacting with subscribers on the OnlyFans platform, passing them off as her own. This behavior was extremely strange and suspicious. Some people who knew Anastasia began to notice inconsistencies in the manner of communication in these messages. They claimed that the responses sent on Anastasia's behalf were not characteristic of her communication style. This was an important clue for investigators, as such actions could mean that Dmitry was not just continuing to use her phone, but was also trying to cover up the crime by creating the illusion that she was still alive. Particular attention was paid to the fact that Dmitry did not report Anastasia's disappearance to the police and did not take any steps to find out what had happened to her. Instead of calling the police or starting a search, he continued his usual activities, responding to messages and even posting on behalf of his deceased girlfriend. This fact became the first serious evidence pointing to his involvement in the crime. The police were able to trace the correspondence and establish that this behavior was not simply a mistake or misunderstanding, but a deliberate act aimed at concealing the fact of the murder. After the investigation into the use of Anastasia's phone was deepened, additional evidence emerged confirming Dmitry's involvement. He tried to present the situation as if everything was fine, creating the illusion that nothing had happened to the girl. His attempts to hide the truth became increasingly obvious. At some point, investigators noticed other oddities in his behavior, such as his refusal to give precise explanations for his actions in the days following Anastasia's disappearance, and his strange behavior in ignoring all normal procedures after the tragedy. This fact finally undermined his alibi. Armed with all this evidence, investigators began to question Dmitry more thoroughly. They discovered that, despite his assurances that he knew nothing about her disappearance, he was in fact aware of what had happened and had attempted to cover up the crime. This behavior, as well as his active use of Anastasia's phone after her death, became the main evidence of his guilt. The use of the victim's phone, attempts to cover up the crime, and manipulation of information became key moments in the case that ultimately led to his arrest and indictment. Thus, Dmitry's actions after the murder were the main factor that allowed the investigation to draw the correct conclusions about his involvement in the crime. The police did not immediately reach a final conclusion, but gradually, step by step, the evidence of his guilt became increasingly clear. In the end, these facts helped put Dmitry Chernyshov on the trail of the crime and strengthened the case against him. On August 11, 2022, Dmitry Chernyshov was arrested on suspicion of murdering his girlfriend Anastasia Kamlovskaya. The police arrested him shortly after establishing that he was the last person to see her alive, and after uncovering his suspicious behavior following her disappearance. Dmitry continued to use Anastasia's phone, responding to messages on her behalf, which became important evidence in the case. This behavior attracted the attention of investigators, as it was a clear sign of an attempt to cover up the crime. At first, Dmitry denied his guilt and tried to justify himself, telling investigators that Anastasia was depressed and had repeatedly asked him for help. He claimed that she was going through a difficult period in her life and could not cope with her inner demons. Dmitry stated that Anastasia had repeatedly told him about her desire to end her life, but could not bring herself to take this step. According to him, she asked him to help her because she saw no way out of her situation and could not cope with her depression. He claimed that at a certain point she asked him to kill her because she couldn't cope with the emotional pain. Dmitry's words sounded like an attempt to justify his actions and shift the blame to Anastasia's mental health. He claimed that her requests became a heavy burden for him and he didn't know what to do. In his testimony, he claimed that he could not refuse her and agreed to fulfill her request, believing that it would be a relief for her. However, as further questioning revealed, this version of events did not correspond to reality. The investigators did not believe this version of events. Their doubts were reinforced when it emerged that after the murder, Dmitry did not report what had happened to the police or to any of her relatives. He continued to respond to messages using Anastasia's phone, which, in light of his testimony, appeared to be an obvious attempt to cover up the crime and cover his tracks. This behavior only reinforced the police suspicions, and they continued to insist on a truthful confession. During further questioning, Dmitry finally confessed to the murder. He told investigators what had really happened and how events unfolded on that fateful night. Dmitry admitted that, despite all his attempts to justify himself to the police, he could not hide the truth. He stated that on that evening, they were lying on the bed in the bedroom when another argument broke out between them. Dmitry said that arguments with Anastasia were not uncommon, especially in the last months of their relationship, when she increasingly complained of depression and personal problems. This time, the conflict became particularly heated. According to Dmitry, at some point he took out a knife, which he said was nearby, and in a fit of rage, stabbed Anastasia several times in the neck. He noted that everything happened very quickly and he couldn't control his emotions. He admitted that he acted under the influence of aggression and jealousy that had been building up for a long time. Dmitry said that despite his cruelty, he did not want to kill Anastasia, but simply vented his aggression, not realizing the full gravity of his actions at the time. He said that after he realized what had happened, he moved Anastasia's body to the bathroom in an attempt to hide the traces of the crime. When investigators asked him why he moved the body to the bathroom, Dmitry replied that he wanted to avoid further trouble. He claimed that he decided not to report the incident to the police because he was confused and did not know how to justify himself to those around him. After that, he continued to respond to messages, trying to create the appearance that Anastasia was alive and well. He said he was trying to prevent her friends and followers from becoming upset, but in reality he was hiding his actions, which was an obvious attempt at manipulation. Dmitry's confession was an important step in solving the crime, but it did not answer all the questions. Investigators continued to examine all the details of that day's events, including possible motives and details that could shed light on why Dmitry chose to act in this way at that particular moment. One of the most important aspects investigators were looking for was motive. Dmitry claimed that his actions were caused by emotional instability and jealousy, but at the same time he did not explain why his behavior at that moment became so violent. The investigation also drew attention to the fact that after the murder, Dmitry continued to behave as if nothing had happened. Not only did he not report the crime to the police, but he also continued to use his deceased girlfriend's phone to communicate with her followers and acquaintances. This strange and inexplicable activity suggested that Dmitry was concerned about how the public would perceive his actions and wanted to hide the facts of the murder. His confession and subsequent testimony helped investigators establish an accurate picture of what happened, but the investigation did not end there. It was important to understand what exactly in their relationship triggered such an act: jealousy, personal conflicts, psychological problems. All of this turned out to be part of a complex picture that led to the tragedy. Thus, Dmitry Chernyshov's confession to the murder of Anastasia Khamlovskaya not only revealed all the circumstances of the tragedy, but also showed his actions after the crime, which became important evidence of his guilt. After Dmitry Chernyshev confessed to the murder of Anastasia Khamlovskaya, the case was referred to court. The trial began in 2023 and became a public trial that attracted public attention, especially given the tragic circumstances and brutality of the crime. The trial took place in the Frunzensky District Court of St. Petersburg. The trial examined key issues such as the motives for the crime, the defendant's behavior before and after the murder, and the evidence obtained during the investigation. Important evidence included Dmitry's confession, his behavior after the murder, and his actions to cover up the crime. Throughout the trial, Dmitry continued to claim that his actions were motivated by intense jealousy and personal problems in his relationship with Anastasia. He admitted that he was unable to control his emotions at the time of the attack, but claimed that he did not intend to kill the girl and only acted in a fit of rage. During the trial, the judge and prosecutor emphasized that the defendant's actions were deliberate and particularly cruel. Despite Dmitry's confession and attempts to justify himself, the prosecution pointed to the fact that the murder was committed with the clear intention of concealing evidence of the crime. An important factor for the court was the defendant's attempt to conceal the murder by continuing to respond to messages on Anastasia's behalf after her death, and by not reporting the incident to the police. These actions were considered an attempt to manipulate public opinion and conceal his involvement in the crime. During the hearings, testimony was also heard from witnesses, including Anastasia's friends and acquaintances, who confirmed that there were serious problems in the relationship between the defendant and the victim, including jealousy and emotional tension. The court hearings lasted several weeks. During the hearings, both sides presented their arguments. The defendant's defense claimed that Dmitry was acting under severe stress and did not realize the full gravity of his actions. In response, the prosecution presented facts confirming the premeditated nature of the murder, including Dmitry's actions after the crime. Psychological aspects were also considered, as the defendant had no previous convictions and no significant psychiatric disorders that could have influenced his behavior. The court found that the defendant was aware of the consequences of his actions and did not act in a state of affect or acute stress, as claimed by the defense. Although Dmitry did experience difficulties in his relationship with Anastasia and was influenced by his emotions, the court found that his actions were calculated and cruel. Psychological evidence did not justify his behavior, and the court took into account that he continued to manipulate the situation after the murder. After all the court hearings were completed, the defense and prosecution presented their conclusions. The prosecutor noted that despite the admission of guilt, the crime was not accidental and was not the result of a momentary outburst of aggression. The prosecution argued that Dmitry committed the murder in order to conceal his actions and manipulate those around him, which is an extremely serious crime. On January 22, 2024, the Frunzensky District Court of St. Petersburg found Dmitry Chernyshev guilty of the murder of his girlfriend, Anastasia Khamlovskaya. The court took into account all the evidence, including the defendant's confession, his behavior after the crime, and the investigation materials. It was established that the motive for the murder was personal animosity and jealousy, which escalated into violent actions. The court found that Dmitry acted with the clear intention of concealing the traces of the crime by continuing to use his deceased girlfriend's phone and responding to messages,